Conversation.
I've been losing all connection to my past life and am rapidly reverting to just a normal 4-year-old. I must find Anonymous while I'm here in Lynx. If only Tom Holland, the Spiders Man, was here to help. But he was swallowed by every single human who works here.
Hello, and welcome to the Kongversation. I'm Hyle Russell.
And I'm Courtney, also known as Alter Mentality.
Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Hyle.
Welcome back to the show. Congratulations, since you were last here for our 20 years of Grab by the Ghoulies episode. You had nuptials. You got married. Congratulations.
Yes, I did. And the cake topper that represented me was a 3D printed Jinjo. So, I'm bringing my whole self to this yellow, of course.
Yellow. Okay, of course. Well, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Just for people who aren't aware.
My husband, I am a yellow Jinjo, but my husband 3D printed a Shy Guy for himself and a Jinjo for me, and then I painted them, so it was a team effort.
I don't think you would have to 3D print a Shy Guy, though. I'm pretty sure you can probably just buy a Shy Guy figure anywhere.
Yeah, but we wanted them both to be like N64 models so that they corresponded to each other.
Fine. And I'm just complaining about the lack of merchandise again.
Yeah.
Every time I'm all turned around. Every time Donkey Kong Country has an anniversary, a big anniversary of 5 years, I have a decision to make here at DK Vine, here at the Kongversation headquarters. And that decision is, will the Kongversation focus in on Donkey Kong Country's anniversary? The one that started it all, really. Or will I instead focus on another major landmark game in the DKU and the mainline Donkey Kong series at that? Because 5 years after Donkey Kong Country came out in November 1994, Donkey Kong 64 was released for the N64, November 22nd, 1999. Now, when this conundrum came up 5 years ago, 2019, Season 7 of the Kongversation, I decided to do an episode on Donkey Kong 64 instead of Donkey Kong Country. But this year, I decided I wasn't going to do an episode on Donkey Kong 64. I wasn't even going to acknowledge the 25th anniversary on the Kongversation because the 30th anniversary of Donkey Kong Country, it just felt like a much bigger deal to me this year. Especially, in light with the theme park that's opening up in Osaka and Orlando next year. And it just felt like that first game meant so much more this year. So I went all in on focusing on that. I mean, we've done anywhere from 7 to 9 episodes with a focus or partial focus on Donkey Kong Country this season. I was just going to ignore Donkey Kong 64's 25th anniversary completely because I didn't feel like I had anything else to say about it right now. And then earlier in this month, you reached out to me and you inquired if I would have any interest in doing a DK64 episode later in November because you wanted to chat about it. Now, I said at the time, well, I don't know because I have so much to get through on the Kongversation for the remainder of the year. I unexpectedly have to talk about Banjo-Tooie in depth with the Geek Critique. I wasn't planning on having any Banjo-Tooie episodes, and then all of a sudden Banjo-Tooie was relevant. It was like a hot talking point again. So I said, I don't know. I don't think we can get around to it, Courtney. And then the Donkey Kong Land games started showing up on NSO as well, and more theme park news kept dropping. And I realized I just lost all control over my life. All semblance.
This minecart is going off the tracks.
I am basically getting ping-ponged back and forth between Nintendo and Rare, and every time I think I'm done for the day, they make some announcement. I'm checking right now to make sure they didn't announce Donkey Kong Land 3 on Nintendo Switch Online, because we were recording this the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And already, since the last time we've recorded a Kongversation, we've had Donkey Kong Land 2 show up on NSO. So I know Donkey Kong Land 3 is like coming in a matter of days. And I'm just like always on call, right? I'm always on alert. So at this point, what does it matter? I'll have to do episodes about everything. So why not squeeze in Donkey Kong 64? Why not give it its due on its quarter century mark? So in this episode of The Kongversation, we're going to reflect on a quarter century of Donkey Kong 64. And as we often do, as we did 5 years ago, we are going to sort of weigh the odd distinction it has in our fandom. Because it's a very polarizing game. But it's odd how polarizing it is, because it's either absolutely beloved and held up as a hallmark of the Nintendo 64, or it's absolutely loathed and denigrated at nearly the same levels that Sonic fandom might loathe Sonic 06. So we're going to find a middle ground here for Donkey Kong 64. For the record, I don't hate it, and I'm not going to be bashing it on this episode. So if you are a fan of DK64, don't worry. This is a safe haven for you. You're not going to hear too much in the way of bad words about the game. I will talk about some issues I have with it, but generally speaking, I have a lot of affection for Donkey Kong 64. It's just complicated. So
I guess I'm kind of the opposite, where like I am extremely passionate about this game. I love it to pieces. It is a huge part of my life, but I do recognize its flaws. So I'm like going to be positive, but also tempering it with like, yeah, it's, kind of, it's a lot.
That's why I also thought this episode would be worthwhile to hear your perspective on the game, and to provide that voice, which I really can't provide myself. So we're going to get into it on this episode. But before we do that, I would like to remind everyone that DK Vine's on Patreon. If you like the conversation, if you like the independent Donkey Kong journalism I do, the news post about all the stuff that's happening sans a new game, then be sure to go to dkvine.com/Patreon and just think about throwing some money to DK Vine's coffers. As little as $1 a month goes a long way. If everybody who listened to the conversation donate $1 a month, then I would be sitting pretty, and I could really invest in more bells and whistles for DK Vine and really make this the enterprise I believe it could be. Because I believe the world, now more than ever, needs independent Donkey Kong journalism. So dkvine.com/Patreon. And as a reminder, as I've been doing all this month, we are on Blue Sky, the fastest growing social media network in the world at the moment. And give us a follow on Blue Sky. It is now my primary social media hub for DK Vine. And because I don't do social media as like myself, I don't have anything to say as me. But under the pseudonym of DK Vine, I do like posting about the DKU and Rare and Platonic. So give us a follow on Blue Sky, please. It's really it's been refreshing not to have that algorithm and not to have crap pushed at me that I don't have to that I don't want to see, and being able to just block freely is really nice. So yeah. If you are on social media, or if you're making a switch to Blue Sky, be sure to give DK Vine a follow. And you're on there too, Courtney.
Yes, I am. I am not very active on social media. I still have my Twitter account, but I've been posting on Blue Sky as well. And I pretty much just post art and like little updates here and there, but I do like to draw things, so if you like rare fan art, then you can give me a follow. I just drew something related to Banjo-Tooie yesterday, so.
Yes, your art is lovely. Give her a follow as well while you're at it. And also, hello to our live stream, because as one of the perks for our patrons, $5 and up, they can listen in on episodes of the Kongversation as we record them. And right now we've got March Rose, Ray Day Pinball, Freezer, Just Andre, Porygon Q, and me, Muppet. So, yeah, we'll be checking in with a live stream as we go to hear them yelling at me about my thoughts on Donkey Kong 64. No. Okay. Well, let's get into it, because I don't even know where to get into it. I think I've got to just roll all the way back and kind of explain how I feel about Donkey Kong 64, because, you know, I'm the Donkey Kong guy, right? Like, that's my online identity. Because I don't post this myself. I am just under that pseudonym of DK Vine. And so people, you know, think you love all Donkey Kong games, like, equally. And you know, I love quite a few Donkey Kong games. Now, some people think they see I'm the Donkey Kong guy and they start talking to me about, like, Donkey Kong 94 or, you know, some, like, minutia of Donkey Kong in, you know, the 1981 arcade original. I'm just like, okay, well, I'm actually the Donkey Kong Country guy. So, I mean, I respect that history, but I don't really have anything to contribute to say to that. Sorry. But a lot of people assume that Donkey Kong 64 is my favorite N64 game. And I've talked about this. One of the most amusing and slightly infuriating social media encounters I've ever had was when somebody just randomly started hate tweeting at me back on the bad place, where they were a Banjo-Kazooie diehard, and they randomly decided to hate tweet the Donkey Kong website because Donkey Kong 64 isn't as good as Banjo-Kazooie, and they wanted me to know it. And I'm just like, you know, we also cover Banjo-Kazooie, and we love Banjo-Kazooie. Like, that's a pretty core component of our website. What are you doing? You're not making me feel bad about myself. I love Banjo-Kazooie. What is this?
That's so weird.
Yeah, it's one of my first interactions with, like, the new latter day Banjo-Kazooie fandom, where they are, like, isolationist, and they're, like, very much, like, anti-Rare anything that's not Banjo-Kazooie. And I'm just like, what? What?
Yeah. Diddy and Banjo are friends. Come on, guys.
Apparently that doesn't count. Apparently that's not real. That's why
that wasn't the real Banjo.
That's why I really want Diddy Kong Racing to come out on NSO and re-skew the perceptions that have just gotten so off track completely. Because Diddy Kong Racing, the original, hasn't been commercially available for so long. And I feel like the youth, they just don't know the actual history, or they have a very distorted perception of that history. Like, no.
But, like, even for Smash Bros, and everybody knows Smash Bros and how, like, excited Diddy and DK and even K. Rool were to see Banjo and Kazooie show up.
Oh, but Smash Brothers isn't canon either, because they're...
that doesn't count either, okay.
Because they're figures, and we can't have joy. We have to be deadly serious about... Let me check my notes here. Oh yeah, the game with a bear and a bird who flutter around. Anyway. So, no, my point being, a lot of people just assume, like, this is my favorite game of all time. And to be fair, I did write a very, like, lauding review of this game when it came out on my baby website. And I wrote a couple articles where I really just tore into the big outlets who are giving it less than perfect reviews. So I have documentation online to my name that says this is the best game of all time. But I do have a lot of genuine nostalgia for Donkey Kong 64, and I have, like, real love for it as well. Like, more than just rose-tinted glasses, there's a lot about this game I think is great. But at the same time, Courtney, it's so frustrating for me. It's...
Mm-hmm.
I realize that for a lot of people within the Donkey Kong or Rare fandom, Donkey Kong 64 is, like, the pinnacle, right? It is the game for them. It's the one that brought them to the dance, the one that even for all of the flaws, which I think a lot of people can at least see, they can't help but just adore it and treasure it and have a good time with it. And I've gone through this battle perceptions with this game within myself on the Kongversation throughout the last 12 years. I remember when it came out on the Wii U eShop, like ages ago at this point, we did our 2-part spotlight episode after that. We thought now would be a good time to do a spotlight on it. Not an anniversary, but the game is relevant. It is in the discussion again. And that ended up being pretty resoundingly negative, that 2-part spotlight, to the point where I regret doing that. And I'm sure some of that negativity was warranted, but I feel like we went harsh on it. One, as an overcorrection to the attitudes we had about it in 1999 when DK Vine was just starting out. But also it was just, I think, an editorial disagreement. Like, I didn't feel as harshly as Chad did about it. And like, I feel like that was kind of an argument I lost at the time. And I don't know. I had a little bit of lament over tearing it down as much as we did. So to make good, 5 years ago, I did the Why Donkey Kong 64 Still Matters episode with Josh Wallen. And I tried to get more in depth about how I really felt about it. Just going back and forth in opinion over the years. And now here I am 5 years after that, talking about it with you. And like I said, I wasn't sure if I really had anything else to say, but I was excited to do this episode with you once I realized I couldn't control the news cycle, because you are somebody who has that love and affection for the game. And that kind of intrigues me to get back in that mindset about it. And one of the reasons I'm excited for it eventually coming to NSO is getting the opportunity to rediscover it yet again. Same way I have with Banjo-Tooie recently, and like relearning the charms of it that I might have forgotten or that might have become dulled over the years. Because, you know, I'm just going to reiterate my own history a little bit here with it, but Donkey Kong 64 is the reason DK Vine even exists. Because ever since the original Donkey Kong Country came out in 1994, there were those rumblings about Nintendo's next console. It wasn't a secret that the Nintendo 64 was coming, or the Nintendo Ultra 64, as it was then known in the West. And when they revealed Donkey Kong Country at the 1994 Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, as we discussed on the Kongversation a few months back, people originally mistook it for being a debut title for the Nintendo 64. So when it did come out in 1994, and Rare, from that point on, more or less became Nintendo's right-hand studio for the next 8 years or so, everyone kind of knew it was inevitable that there was going to be an N64 sequel to Donkey Kong Country. How could there not be? It was just something that we all knew and all kind of took for granted. And honestly, I think it was one of the quiet selling points of the system, at least here in the West, because if you were a DKC fanatic, an absolute diehard who lived and breathed every new Donkey Kong release from Rare, every Donkey Kong Country and Donkey Kong Land, the Nintendo 64 was going to be a system that was kind of just baked into that hype cycle in a way that I don't feel like we've had as a collective fan base since then. Certainly, like the GameCube, we were hyped for certain games, but I don't feel like it was quite the same kind of sensation as, oh, look what Rare can do on the Super Nintendo. Imagine what they could do on the Nintendo 64. It was more just like, oh, this is going to be more of the same, but slightly more advanced with the GameCube. And then, of course, after the buyout, we kind of lost all hope for a while. And it might be the next Switch 2, whatever, where we are feeling a little bit more optimistic about Donkey Kong's future again. But yeah, the N64, we knew the Donkey Kong game on that was going to be something that was going to blow our minds. And that promise of a new 3D Donkey Kong Adventure, because of course we knew it was going to be 3D. Everything on the N64 was 3D. Why wouldn't it be 3D? We were ready. Like I remember, like, I was very, very excited about Donkey Kong Country 2, obviously. And once it became apparent that Rare, had to finish the trilogy, we have to have that nice even set, or I guess odd set of 3 games on the Super Nintendo and 3 games on the Game Boy. You got to have a nice trilogy there. Once that became apparent, then we were like, okay, so it'll be about a year or so before we'll get Donkey Kong on the Nintendo 64, because Donkey Kong Country 3 is coming out November 1996. So obviously November 1997 will be Donkey Kong World or whatever they're going to call it. And then, well, it didn't really happen like that, did it? So Donkey Kong Land 2, which just came out on NSO, that came out the same day as the N64 here in the West. And so I got Donkey Kong Land 2 the day the N64 came out, and I was like, I'm not going to get an N64 until they announce the Donkey Kong game. But then fate kind of threw me a curveball because Donkey Kong was going to be in Mario Kart 64. So I had to get an N64 for Mario Kart 64 because the Donkey Kong Country style Donkey Kong was going to be in it. But knowing that at the same time I was playing Donkey Kong Country 3 later that year, I remember thinking, okay, Kiddy Kong is the 4th playable Kong. There are 4 controller ports on the N64. Obviously, this means that we are going to have 4 playable Kongs in the Donkey Kong game on the N64. And it's going to be Donkey, it's going to be Diddy, it's going to be Dixie, it's going to be Kiddy. It was just the most logical thing to someone on the outside looking in. That was how Rare was going to do it. It was all set up for them. And so E3 1997, Courtney, I was so excited. I was absolutely giddy about getting any news because I knew they were going to show off Donkey Kong for the N64 with those 4 Kongs in a 3D world. And then that didn't happen either. Instead, Rare announced a 3D platformer. Actually, they announced 2 3D platformers at E3 97. Neither were Donkey Kong. It was Banjo-Kazooie and Conker's Quest. And then for a couple of months, I held a lot of confusion and even resentment towards those 2 games and Rare because they weren't making Donkey Kong right away. I thought they were going to make us wait even longer for Donkey Kong, and I was mad about it. Why are they wasting their time with these new characters that nobody cared about when they could just be doing Donkey Kong, which is the game everybody wanted, which is the game that the promise and hype of the N64 was partially built on? This was obviously a great deal of immaturity on my part. I was a kid. Go easy on young me, but that feeling of spite did not last, as I've discussed here on the conversation in the past as well, because Banjo-Kazooie was delayed. Pro-Am 64 was then pushed up and rebranded as Diddy Kong Racing. And also, yes, younger Banjo-Kazooie fans, debuted Banjo and Conker as friends of Diddy Kong, who also lived in his world, lived in the archipelago of islands that now constituted their world. And that helped launder both Banjo-Kazooie and Conker's Quest into games I could be hyped for as a Donkey Kong fanatic. It gave me that permission. It was like,
yes, you're allowed.
Yeah, they weren't interlopers withholding the Donkey Kong game from me. They were now genuine spin-offs of Donkey Kong that I could enjoy on the path to the Donkey Kong game. So now I just had more stuff to look forward to. Life was suddenly great. And then Banjo-Kazooie came out in the middle of 1998, and it was, in my opinion, 3D platforming perfection. It became one of my favorite games of all time, and it still is to this day. And then that stop and swap mystery at the end of it kept really the engagement and speculation about Banjo-Kazooie going long after I had finished it. It really kept that game relevant persistently. All the conspiracy theories and just excitement about Banjo-Tooie that was kind of baked in to the end game of Banjo-Kazooie. And of course, I still had what was then known as 12 Tales Conquer 64 to look forward to. But my thought at the time, as somebody who had come into this generation wanting nothing but the N64 Donkey Kong game, if Banjo-Kazooie was this good and this engaging and blew me away to this extent, then obviously Donkey Kong's N64 adventure would have to be that tenfold. It couldn't be anything less. So already this very hyped game that I had, that I've been dreaming about since 1994, was this god tier revelation carried down from on high. It was going to be something that the world had never seen, and it couldn't be anything less than that. And of course, I didn't know anything at the time about the different Rare teams. Like, I recognized names in the credits of games, but we didn't know. There was nothing to tell us that Greg Mayles would not really be working on Donkey Kong 64, or even who Greg Mayles was or how important he was to something like Banjo-Kazooie or the first two Donkey Kong Country games. We didn't know that at the time. So, to make a long story as short as I can, Donkey Kong 64 was officially announced on New Year's 1999. Although, we knew about it. We knew it was coming because Lee Loveday did cop to it on the Rare website the previous year. Like, he just blatantly said, yeah, of course we're working on Donkey Kong. Why wouldn't we be? So, from there, from the announcement of Donkey Kong 64, that was kind of where my primary fandom focus rested for the rest of the year. I kind of put Tooie on the back burner. Conquer was this thing that was coming, but it was more nebulous. And then every DKU game, or mostly appearances of Donkey Kong, from January to November 22nd, which was also my birthday, so it was really like this extra special thing that Donkey Kong 64 was coming out on my actual birthday. It just seemed like kismet. It just seemed like fate, right? So every game till then felt like a prelude to this grand unveiling. Mario Party and Super Smash Bros., they were just what Donkey Kong was getting up to before his greatest adventure ever. Conker's Pocket Tales. That was what Conker was doing before Donkey Kong's greatest adventure. Mario Golf. That was obviously what Donkey Kong was doing while Wrinkly Kong was on her deathbed, and Donkey Kong didn't know it. Heartbreaking, right? So, for me, this got to the point of an obsession. And the constant long-winded post I would make on Nintendo.com's insider forums started to annoy everyone on there. People didn't care about it as much as I did, which made me angry. Because how could they not? Did I not tell you? Did I not explain to you just now how this was going to be the greatest game of all time? And look at all the evidence I just laid out. So I realized, oh no, I am a freak in a land of normies. I need to make a website for rare sickos like me. So Chad, who had joined the Insider Forum around that time, felt the same way. We decided to pull our resources, combine our talents. That led to DK Vine. And then 3 months after that, Donkey Kong 64 finally came out. I really wanted to like it, and I told myself exactly what I felt like I was supposed to believe, that it was the greatest game of all time, that it was everything I had wanted, everything I had hoped for. And, like, this was 1999, so there was a lot of this in the air. Star Wars Episode 1 had just come out that May. So there was a lot of that with that movie as well, with the Star Wars fandom, because, you know, it was a new Star Wars movie, the fourth Star Wars movie from George Lucas. How could that not be a work of art? I mean, Empire Strikes Back. This is basically the same thing. Like, the flaws in that were obviously intentional and interesting and a unique, bespoke style of filmmaking you just don't see anymore in Hollywood. That's all that was. It's just genius that won't be respected for another 20 years. And look, I did like quite a bit about Donkey Kong 64. That's not a lie. That wasn't deluding myself. I really did. It just failed to hang together in the way I think I expected it to be. The way Banjo-Kazooie did, or how Banjo-Tooie even would a year later. And I couldn't really articulate it at the time because I didn't want to articulate it at the time why I did have that disappointment. But it felt a bit more cartoony, a bit more silly, a bit more slapsticky than the Donkey Kong Country games had. I mean, there was a lot of slapstick in the Donkey Kong Country games, but either because of the limitations on the Super Nintendo or just the style of the team, it felt more understated. Maybe it was the David Wise and Evelyn Novakovic soundtracks that kind of helped obscure that and kind of bring this level of decorum, I don't know, to the shenanigans, but it felt a little bit more whimsical, I guess, than past Donkey Kong games from Rare. The tone was kind of all over the place at times.
Oh yeah,
and
that's something I want to get into later for sure.
Donkey Kong was kind of portrayed as an idiot, which was a little bit weird.
Donkey all confused.
Donkey all confused. I mean, stuff I love now, or at least embrace. Because it's so redonkulous even. I did have a problem with back then, but I told myself I didn't. I told myself, like The Phantom Menace, it was just a misunderstood work of art. But it was the first time, I think, that really having different creatives behind the scenes was readily apparent, or felt readily apparent, even in a way we didn't want to acknowledge. And after some time, I think some narratives set in, because I had swung so hard in defending the game, because I was so passionate on a public forum, my very new website, like coming out of that era, coming to terms with the way I behaved in that time. I think I had to overcorrect, or I felt like I had to overcorrect. I had to kind of tear down the game a little bit too much, to kind of rebuild myself, to kind of make myself into a respectable voice. I had to just be like, oh, I was a complete idiot for liking that piece of trash. And doing that, though, I was still coming at it from my own insular perspective, with all of my history baked in. I wasn't looking at what the game meant for fans and gamers who were perhaps a little bit younger than I was, who were coming into this not as the long-awaited culmination of everything Rare had set up from 1994 on, but the introduction to the world of Donkey Kong, the world of Rare, the world of the DKU. For a lot of people, this was the entry point. And of course, as somebody who had spent 5 years just producing copious amounts of saliva thinking about this game, it's a perspective I couldn't get myself into, to my own detriment, to the detriment of DK Vine, to the detriment of our own voice.
Imagine having to wait 5 years for a DK game. That would be crazy.
I know, right? Especially with all the other Donkey Kong games in the middle of all that. Guy, could you imagine? Oh, I have to wait 5 years for this game, but luckily we're going to have 5 Donkey Kong games in between, and a Diddy Kong game, and spin-offs, and Donkey Kong guest appearances that don't annoy me yet. Wow. Hard times. Hard times. So that was a very long-winded backstory for my Donkey Kong 64 experience. Now I want to hear your Donkey Kong 64 experience, because it is a conversation. It is not just a rambling monologue from a sad, sad man past his prime.
I do have one question for you, though. So, you wanted to convince yourself that you loved it, but like deep in your heart of hearts, you were disappointed. Would you say this was like your first big gaming disappointment? Because, you had such a very focused fandom with what you enjoyed. So would you say this is the first time a video game truly disappointed you?
There had been other minor disappointments along the way. Like I think Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island disappointed me because it wasn't what I was expecting for a game called Super Mario World 2. It's a game I can appreciate more nowadays, but obviously it didn't disappoint me. It didn't cut to my core the same way Donkey Kong 64 did because, yeah, by that point I was just all in on the DKU, and I had never like waited 5 years for a game. Like that was inconceivable at that point in my life. So yeah, I would say it's my first like actual defined disappointment, but it's one I didn't come to terms with immediately, of course, like because I didn't let myself know I was disappointed for quite some time. Right. And it's funny too, because like I mentioned Sonic 06 earlier in this episode. I don't think Donkey Kong 64 is a bad game. I think it's a flawed game, but those flaws can be interesting. Whereas like Sonic 06, I think most are in agreement that's a bad game. Like that's kind of a disaster. And like it was Josh Wallen who helped put that in perspective for me watching his videos about the matter, because I was like, I guess I have been too hard on Donkey Kong 64 because in all actuality, it's not bad. It's just got too many cooks in the kitchen. It's got too much going on, too many compromises being made, but there are quality bits. You just have to get to those quality bits, and there's kind of some tedium between those bits, in my opinion.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can tell you my story. So, I am a little bit younger than you, not hugely, but for context, I was 8 years old when... How old were you when DK64 came out?
Shit, math. 15, going on 16.
Okay, so I was 8 years old when it came out.
Okay, so yeah.
So, a little bit. And my first video game, really, well, I had like an Atari. My parents had an Atari 2600.
Same.
But I don't really count that.
Yeah.
So my first real video game.
Can I just say really quick? I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to do one of those engagement bait things on Blue Sky last night, and the first like talking point was, what is your first video game? What was your first video game? And I was like, well, I guess it was something I played on my parents' Atari 2600, but do I really count that? And so I just had the internal monologue with myself last night, and I ultimately just ended up not doing it because I was like, yeah, I'm already like befuddling myself with what counts, and I just want to get to the Donkey Kong relevant bits of this, so I'm just not going to do this.
Yeah, so I'm like pretty much the exact same thing. Like technically my first video game that I ever saw or played would be Combat on the Atari 2600, but the first one that I count, because the first one that like really felt like a video game instead of just dots on a screen, was Super Mario World, which I got when I was 3 years old on the Super Nintendo. And obviously I was 3 years old, so there wasn't very much I could do with it. I just could like maybe beat the first level by running forward and jumping on Yoshi. And I could beat like maybe the first few levels of it. But the first game I got that I truly fell in love with was Donkey Kong Country. And I've talked about this before. I actually didn't own it for a while, but we rented it. And that was the first game that felt like a real world was existing behind the screen. It just completely opened my imagination up and made me into like a video game lover instead of just video games being something that were there in my house that I played with like toys. So we rented Donkey Kong Country, and then that year, the year I played it was the year that DKC3 was coming out. So instead of getting DKC for me, my parents just decided to get the new one that was coming out. So my first DKC game that I owned was DKC3, and I think I've talked about this before, maybe way back on like the female characters in rare games podcast that we did years ago when I was talking about how important Dixie Kong was for me. And I ended up getting DKC2 shortly after that, and that became my favorite game of all time immediately. It hasn't changed for 20 years. It's the best game ever.
Same.
So I was already this huge DKC fan when I was like 5 years old up until, the next few years of my life. I loved these games. I did end up getting DKC eventually, and so I had all three of them, and I would just play them on the Super Nintendo over and over. I did little fan art in my, 6-year-old way of drawing Dixie Kong and Diddy Kong and, just like trying to imitate a screenshot of the game. So I was, obviously to my parents, I was a huge Donkey Kong fan. And I didn't get an N64 immediately because I was plenty happy with my Super Nintendo. We didn't have like the most money when I was younger, so my parents weren't going to get the brand new console immediately. And it was, I kind of kept up with gaming news very slightly. Like, I didn't have that much, I was like 7 or 8 years old, so obviously my parents were smart to not let me spend too much time on the, America Online dial-up internet or whatever. I pretty much get on to just go to like Keyword, Cartoon Network or whatever, and play Flash games. But, I was able to hear a little bit about what games are coming out through commercials and whatever. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have a strong desire to get an N64. I heard about Diddy Kong Racing, but for some reason I was never that big into racing games, so it didn't excite me that much. But then when I heard about Donkey Kong 64, I was like, that's crazy. There's a new Donkey Kong game. I'm 8 years old, and this seems awesome. And so for Christmas that year, the year it came out, I got a bundle, the Jungle Green N64 bundle DK64. I have it sitting right next to me, like a foot away. And, the good old yellow DK64 cartridge. And this was my intro to the world of gaming in the third dimension, because I can't say I might have like played a little bit of Spyro at my friend's house or something, but really nothing to speak of. So this was really my first experience with being able to fully explore an open game world. Just, and it was immediately the most incredible thing I had ever experienced in a way that I don't think anything can possibly ever recreate. Like, you spoke earlier of there being this huge hype around the N64 because of the games being in 3D and everything, and like nothing is ever going to live up to that again. And I fully believe it. Like, if you didn't grow up during this time, there's really no way to communicate how big it felt to go from the SNES to the N64.
Oh yeah.
Because it's just like, I guess the only thing that could maybe compare to it now is like VR, but VR exists and it just really hasn't made the same type of splash for whatever reason. Maybe because it's prohibitively expensive for a lot of people, or it makes people motion sick. I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
I remember like not being impressed with screenshots of like Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wing 64, seeing them in Nintendo Power or online. Mm-hmm. I was like, this looks like garbage compared to Donkey Kong Country 2, the greatest game of all time. I'm supposed to be impressed with this. And then I remember seeing the demo of Super Mario 64 on the kiosk in Toys R Us. It's the first time I saw it in motion, and I think it honestly took my breath away. Like, I understand, my brain could process what I was seeing, and I could understand, like, oh, wow. Like, we are, like, entering a new era of video games, and it's never going to be the same ever again. And I don't think I've had that feeling since then. Like, nothing has really done it. It's been incremental, like, steps. Oh, visuals are slightly better. But it'll never capture that feeling, I don't think, in my lifetime.
Right. So, to continue the story, I was kind of just about the age where I was sort of gaining independence when it came to video games. Like, I was able to start, like, beating video games on my own. And I had always played the Super Nintendo with my parents. Like, I would watch my dad get through the harder levels of Donkey Kong Country 2, and he would complain about it because I would make him sit there until he beat like Rickety Race or whatever. And now I was, me and my little brother, who was a few years younger than me. This is when my parents kind of let us go on our own, because they tried to play DK64 with us when it came out, and they were so overwhelmed by the, 3D concept, but also just all of the collectibles and this, looking back of all the games to introduce someone to 3D gaming with, it's such an overwhelming one, compared to, like, if you had started them with SM64 or Banjo-Kazooie, it probably would have seemed a lot less overwhelming, but they probably just thought, like, oh, this is what games are like now. There's, like, 10,000 collectibles, and just, it's huge, and we just don't have time for this anymore. We're, like, adults. Like, my mom was a teacher. She was super busy. My dad had a bunch of other stuff he was taking care of. It's like, all right, kids, the video games are your things now. We're just not interested anymore.
Yeah. My parents,
yeah,
my parents still played some stuff on the Super Nintendo with me, and then the N64 came out, and I think it broke their brains, and they didn't pick up video games again until Wii Sports, the bowling. Because they got a Wii before I did, because my parents and my now deceased grandparents both owned Wiis separately before I did.
Yeah, my parents, I don't think have ever really gotten back into gaming at all, but I did every now and then. I would find my dad in the garage just like playing the Super Nintendo still, so he didn't fall out of it. It's just that the 3D, the N64 era and beyond was just increasingly overwhelming for them. So I have a favorite story about DK64, which is the tutorial area that you first do in the game. It's called the training grounds in the community, but it should take you, like, I don't know, 5 minutes max to get through. You just go do all the little tutorial barrels, then you hit the button and you leave. It took me and my parents probably about 2 hours to figure out how to get out of there, just because we were trying to figure out, like, how do you use this controller? Like, what are you supposed to do? There's this button here that has DK's face on it, and the instruction manual says that you're supposed to ground pound it, but if you it doesn't work. We didn't realize you had to go to Cranky to learn how to do it first. So we just, like, spent such a long time exploring this small area, but to me, it was the most magical thing in the world, and I have such a nostalgic fondness for that little area that you start out in, because we were just stuck there for a long time, couldn't figure out, like, how to navigate this world whatsoever.
I remember like just loitering in that area on purpose, because like I was going to play it with my friend Elliot like that weekend. And because of that, like I like made a promise to myself I would only play the training area, and I wouldn't even save. It was just going to be like I was going to get the feel of it. And so I like spent hours of my own volition in that training area, just soaking in every detail. I love that area because of the like special memories I have for it, and because I still thought like, oh, it's only gonna get better from here. It's only gonna get better from here.
Yeah, I'm glad we both have a fondness for that area. I loved going into the banana horde. You'd like slip on the banana peels that were left there, and stuff like that. But so basically, DK64 was a game that I had to get through on my own, and my brother was like 5, so he pretty much just watched me, and I don't know how long it took me to beat that game the first time. Probably months, to be honest, because there's just so much in it, and it was hard to figure out a lot of stuff, and a lot of the stuff was hard to do, especially if you were a little kid. And the only part I remember my dad having to do for me for sure was the DK arcade. I straight up could not beat that when I was 8 years old. I made him try it over and over and over until he got it, and I am so sorry for making him do that now that I know how it is. It's pretty hard considering the constraints they put on you with your lives and stuff. I could do Jetpack. Jetpack is not hard, but...
Yeah, Jetpack, I feel like you just fumbled around enough and you would get it eventually. You didn't have to be good at it. You just kind of mashed it around.
You just hold the shoot button down, and eventually you'll probably luck into get it if you try hard enough.
Yeah, Donkey Kong Arcade was like brutally hard in the context of 1999. Like not hard in the way we had been trained to process hard things. It was just a slog.
That requires actual skill for sure. And it did blow my mind though, because that was the first time I had ever encountered a game within another game.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the original Donkey Kong game. It's just inside another video game. You can do that.
You can do that? Yeah.
Like, it was just physically in the arcade there in the world of DK64. I still think that's really cool, but I can kind of channel how I felt when I was young, and seeing that for the first time just is a completely mind-blowing concept. And so, yeah, I eventually got other N64 games that I fell in love with, Banjo-Kazooie, maybe about a year later or something. But I feel like for those first few months, all I had was DK64, and that's all I needed, because the game was so massive, and it kept me entertained. And I think the second game I got was like Pokemon Stadium or something, but all I needed for a long time. I think that's kind of what the game was made for. Like, they made this game to keep children entertained for a really long time, and it succeeded in my case. And, looking back, I definitely, over the years, I saw the criticisms of DK64, and I agreed with them, of course, but as a child, I didn't really comprehend the shift in tone. Like, it was definitely more cartoony and silly, but I didn't really have the eyes to see that or care about it at the time, because I was less than 10 years old. And so looking back, it's definitely kind of jarring when you compare it to the SNES games. DKC3 was kind of getting there already. It was a little bit more silly, a little bit more like bright colors and stuff. But, at the time, I didn't care, and the affection that I have for DK64 is completely untainted by any kind of criticism like that, because I didn't register it until later. And, yeah, I mean, if you want to get into, like, maybe some of our opinions on the game overall, because but I guess the finale of my story to get to present day is that I loved this game to pieces when I was a kid. As I got older, I saw people being more and more critical of it, and I was always like, yeah, well, I like it because, I grew up with it, and it's kind of like a guilty pleasure game to me. I know it's bad, but I love it. But in recent years, I would say I've noticed a lot more people who genuinely do love the game, and that's helped me to come into my own again and just admit, like, yeah, you know what? It has flaws, it's bloated, it's kind of absurd, but I genuinely love it, and I'm not ashamed to say that.
Yeah, it's funny because I just go back and forth on Donkey Kong 64 so much, and what I have to hold on to in the positive is those like warm feelings it does give me in between all the little irritations and all the little things. They're like, why did they do that? Why make that choice? There's just enough there that I do look back on with fondness and affection. And it is just like, I think the most bizarre game in my library, in my personal history, because I do just go back and forth on it so much. And it can be just completely arbitrary. I will wake up one day feeling very, very loving towards Donkey Kong 64, and then the very next day I'll wake up and be like, why did they have that worm that talks to you in the apple? That sucked. And I don't know. I don't know what it is. In a live stream, March Rose says, I played DKC with my grandparents growing up, and they really enjoyed the game too. So they got me the green N64 so they could also play DK64 with me. We beat it, if I'm not mistaken, but they definitely did not like how much backtracking you had to do and how much it changed from the SNES games. That's impressive that your grandparents stuck with it. Like I said, my parents, like, Super Mario 64 broke them. They just tapped out of that one almost instantaneously.
Wrinkly tried to play SM64 and it literally killed her.
I don't know. She was doing pretty well for a certain point. It wasn't until what else came out in 1999? I don't even remember on the 64. It wasn't until Mario Golf, that she died. She tried to get.
She died of boredom playing. Sorry, I really hate golf games.
Oh, but Mario Golf is fine. It was.
I'm sure it is. The only golf game that I like is Kirby's Dream Course. That game slaps.
Kirby's Dream
anyway.
Course, I do have that. I did have quite a good time with it, but I wasn't ever good at it. I think if anything killed Wrinkly Kong, it was the ring shot. That was a night. So the weekend before Donkey Kong 64 came out, I had not beaten Mario Golf yet, and I was like, I have to beat Mario Golf before Donkey Kong 64 comes out. So I was cramming like a kid who hadn't done his homework, who hadn't done his big book report like the day before. I was cramming, and I remember spending most of that weekend trying to finish the ring shot, and I did it, but yeah, I can see why she died. So
proud of you.
Knowing what we know about Donkey Kong 64's very tortured development history, I think it makes me forgive it a little bit more, but it also makes me incredibly pissed. It's the eternal struggle with me with Donkey Kong 64, because I am so mad that the original vision of this game didn't come to fruition, Courtney. So, any Donkey Kong 64 discourse I see online inevitably makes me chuckle, because I'm like, you're not telling the whole story. You don't know the whole story. We don't know the whole story yet. The whole story hasn't been told, because the biggest tale about Donkey Kong 64 and its history is still under lock and key at Rare. Not anything with the release game we've gotten, not anything about the stop and swap functionality that Paul Makachek has basically divulged everything he remembers about. All of that stuff is kind of ancillary to the main event. I'm talking about the original builds of Donkey Kong 64 that were going to be a lot more faithful to the core identity of the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. So I occasionally see this called like the 2.5D version of Donkey Kong 64, and a lot of people assume that means it's a 2D platformer. Or maybe a top-down game. But I think the best way to describe what Rare devs who actually worked on it have called it is, it's not too dissimilar from that early build of Banjo-Kazooie coming out of Project Dream, where Banjo was running around that jungle-like environment. And we eventually got like pictures of it in his house, and we thought it was fungus forest. And we were like, ooh, we're going to get the ice key, or we're going to get the eggs, and it's going to unlock this world in the one room down where you do the puzzle for Click Clock Wood. And that wasn't the case. It was just an early build of Banjo-Kazooie, but we got some renders based off of it somehow, like that were released, and so it really, really confused the conspiracy-minded stop-and-swap enthusiast out there. But yeah, that's the original build of Donkey Kong 64. It was kind of from that perspective. But then they kind of shifted it. They adjusted it a little bit, and I think it became more Crash Bandicoot style after that, with a camera angle and character models that were a lot closer to what we got in the final version of Donkey Kong 64 that was actually released, except think far more compact 3D levels. Like Crash Bandicoot, like you've got these little 3D environments that aren't these sprawling worlds where you have untold collectibles. It was a lot more linear. It was a lot more structured along the lines of Donkey Kong Country, only in that 3D space. And we know this was the vision of Andrew Collard, who took over the Donkey Kong Country trilogy with Donkey Kong Country 3 as game designer. So he was effectively the new Greg Mayles on Donkey Kong through Donkey Kong Country 3 into the early days of Donkey Kong 64. Until the Stamper Brothers decided that the game they were making just wasn't working, or at least wasn't working from what they thought would be successful in the marketplace. Because they thought that if a game wasn't to the scope or scale of Super Mario 64 or Banjo-Kazooie for that matter, then it just would fail to impress on the N64. And I also think there were concerns that they were actually being able to pull it off. Like, you could build a game like this on the N64 and have it be robust enough. I think having these little 3D levels in these, like, in the world structure, I don't think the N64 had the space to really achieve what they were trying to do. And of course, I've never played the early builds of Donkey Kong 64. Like I said, under lock and key at Rare. I just think I can imagine how untenable it was to do that Donkey Kong Country, but with the levels in 3D style. But I also like struggle with the question of just making it sort of a more bloated version of Banjo-Kazooie, if that was the correct direction to take it, if the early versions weren't working. Because at least when 12 Tales, I know you might disagree with me on this one, Courtney, but at least when 12 Tales was struggling to find an identity post Banjo-Kazooie, it did something completely different to justify its existence, and I think it did.
Yeah, I mean, I am not a fan of Conker, but I respect what it did, and I know a lot of people like it, so I respect them for not making just yet another like cartoony animal platformer.
I like
doing something different with it.
I like Bad Fur Day. It's not my favorite compared to the Banjos, but I respect that it found its direction. I do kind of mourn a little bit that we didn't get 12 Tales, because I think a lot of that looked interesting, but I also recognize that it's probably better for the long-term notoriety of Conker to go in the Bad Fur Day direction. But yeah, like with Donkey Kong 64, I think it was a couple different factors, the stampers and maybe it just not being able to hang together like they wanted to. They're just like, all right, let's just make it the biggest, most unseemly 3D platformer that the world will ever see. I think Collard's vision of what Donkey Kong 64 was going to be is honestly a lot closer to what I retroactively argued the game should have been, even before I knew that's exactly what he was going to do. That's the direction he was pushing for. Whether or not the final product could have gotten there, I don't know. Nobody does. But George Andreas was the one who then took over the project. And because it kind of rebooted behind the scenes so late, I mean, it was late 1998. I want to say like maybe summer 1998 when they did this big, massive realignment for Donkey Kong 64. And then from there, it was a race to get it done by November 1999. Like, they didn't start over from scratch. I think they reused a lot of the assets from that last build under the Collard regime, but it was like basically reinventing the game from the ground up. And because of that, the 2E and Conker teams had to jump in very late in the day to get the game over the finish line. We know that Chris Seaver designed Glower the Tadpole in Gloomy Galleon. Ed Bryan was the one who designed the game's box art. Greg Mayles designed the final boss fight with King K. Rool. So Greg Mayles did contribute to Donkey Kong 64. I think Andrew Collard's vision for Donkey Kong 64, however, would work brilliantly in the modern day if anybody would be willing to make it. So I think the most interesting stories to be told about Donkey Kong 64 have not been told yet. And it kind of blows me away that nobody who's left Rare in the years since have really opened up about this. It's kind of been radio silence. Occasionally you'll get somebody who worked on Rare saying, yeah, I remember the version that we were working on, and they'll go into very vague details, but they won't really like lay it out for us. And I think once that dam breaks and the world is privy to what happened, as we have been made privy to so much behind the scenes at Rare from that era, except this game, I think that that will be a huge revelation for a lot of people about what they actually had cooking up. But
yeah, I hope we get that someday. But I mean, I wonder if it has to do with the fact that it's like a first-party Nintendo property, and it's one thing for Greg Mayles to be like, "Oh, here's some Kremlings we didn't use in Donkey Kong Country," but it's kind of another thing for them to say, "Well, here's like a game featuring Donkey Kong himself, but here's this complete different version of it that could have been." So I don't know if there's some kind of like Nintendo NDA sort of thing going on there.
There could
I
be.
don't know.
There very well could be. And why does Nintendo care? It's been 25 years.
Yeah, I don't know.
Come on. Come on. Oh.
Come on.
Anyway, that being said, coming to terms with all of that, I kind of forgive the game a little bit more because they were sort of in an unwinnable position because they were going this direction for the entire time it was in development, and then they just kind of hit the brick wall, whether that's through a limit of technology or the stampers saying, this doesn't feel like what people would expect from a 3D Donkey Kong game in 1999. We have to reboot. Whatever the reason, whoever's at fault or not at fault, whoever saved the project and salvaged what they could, I look back at it now and I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it does feel like a game full of little compromises. And honestly, like looking at the history of games that have just been outright canceled on us, Donkey Kong Racing, hi. I'm glad we got something. Because it would have been far more heartbreaking to not get a Donkey Kong game on the N64 at all, rather than get one that's divisive and maybe fell short of the wildly unrealistic expectations that had been set by weirdos like me.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I think obviously the game is kind of held together with duct tape, as everyone knows, but it is a huge game, and I think it's super impressive what they were able to accomplish in that amount of time.
It really is. Like, the game itself is a technical marvel for the day. I think that people forget because it's not as much of a giant leap forward that Donkey Kong Country was on its hardware, but Donkey Kong 64 is very pretty for an N64 game. Like, the lighting, the effects, it does look absolutely gorgeous, all things considered. And
another thing is that, like, obviously the game has a lot of glitches, which are pretty easy to perform, even if you're just casual and you happen into them on accident. But it's one of those situations where, like, people always talk about how broken the game is, but by focusing on that, they kind of ignore the huge amount of technical achievement to make the game work as well as it does.
Yes.
And it's like one of those things where people talk about how broken, like, Gen 1 Pokemon is while ignoring the massive achievement of fitting a game like that on the Game Boy, let alone Gen 2 as well. Because people have, like, so many people have played those games and so many people have discovered, you know, like, every inch of everything that could possibly go wrong in them. But, like, that's just one side of the story when you take it for granted that the game does function as well as it does the vast majority of the time. Like, considering everything that is in this game, I think it's really impressive what they were able to pull off.
I think the flaws in Gen 1 Pokemon just make it more interesting. It was almost like a little bit of the stop and swap thing with me. Because, yeah, people forget I was part of that hype train for Gen 1 Pokemon. I was playing that game as religiously as anybody else was when it came out. And yeah, it's like, ooh, you know, you can get like unlimited Master Balls. You can do this. You can warp here, you know, missing no, and you know, all of that. Like, that stuff was like crack to young me. It was like, you know, secret forbidden playground knowledge. And
right.
You know, Donkey Kong 64's
and I wanted
faults and bugs. My argument is that maybe you don't need to do that. Maybe you don't need to exploit that. Maybe you just play the game as intended and you'll have a better time rather than focusing on, oh, I can break it like this. Well, you don't need to break it like that. You could just try to play fair and by the rules.
Well, I'll talk about the speedrun in a little bit if you want me to. But as far as the glitches go, this is the first game I ever played in my life where I really understood what a glitch was, or whatever you want to call them, an exploit. I always called them glitches when I was younger, but just stuff like being able to go through the wall, or I discovered some of this on accident, just playing around, and like, you know, it's fairly easy to do in certain spots, like against corners and certain seams and the geometry, and when you're swimming, it's especially easy. So some of this I discovered on my own, and I was like, I'm inside the level, or I'm in this void, And it's like, what is going on here? This is incredible. I just entered this different dimension. So I started looking up that kind of stuff online and discovered a bunch of other ones you can do. And that's how I discovered DK Vine in the first place, I believe, was just from looking up stuff about DK64 on the internet. And I had a lot of fun back in the day. Like, people would report like, oh, if you go to this part of the level and do a backflip at just this angle, you can get out into the world. And I would always try to recreate whatever I heard about. And it was a lot of fun of just like playing around with the game. And obviously I was still beating it legitimately and everything, but it was the first game that I appreciate how kind of broken it was, because like, it's just really not as easy to do stuff like this in, say, Banjo-Kazooie. And if I hadn't started with DK64, who knows how long it would have taken me to discover just this kind of like meta stuff you can do playing around with the game.
Yeah, I remember that I only stumbled across one instance of this while playing through the game originally. It was in Angry Aztec. I was Tiny Kong. I was in one of the temples, and I just like fell through the floor into the lower chamber, and I was able to get a gold banana like far easier than I should have. And I was just like, oh, I guess it's a faulty floor. Like, even then my brain was just trying to rationalize like, oh, that was intentional, clearly. Like that.
Yeah, there's this one thing you can do in Jungle Japes in the like mountain that Diddy goes into, like the Mayan area, where you can fall through the floor and there's just an extra red banana down there. I don't know why they put it there, but you can get Diddy 101 bananas in that level if you get this random banana that's under the floor. Like, it's just so silly. I love it.
Yeah. I guess, what do we like about Donkey Kong 64? That's probably a good place to kind of take us after like all the little caveats we've said about its flaws. What persists about Donkey Kong 64 that we both find endearing and we both love genuinely without shame to this day? And I'll start off. For me, Tiny, Chunky, and Lanky are all terrific additions to the cast. Even though, yes, they are not Dixie or even Kitty, and I still feel like Dixie or Kitty, it's so weird. They just decided, they elected not to put them in this, because what? I can't help but love those three Kongs, and honestly, it's hard to imagine a Donkey Kong 64 without them at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I love all three of them. When I was a kid, I related to Tiny a lot. Like, you know, I've already talked about how much I love Dixie and she was a hero of mine, but I am especially a very small person. I have always been proportionately small. I am 4'10" today, and I was always like the small compared to everybody else. And so the fact that there was a Kong named Tiny and that was her thing, is that she could get smaller. That was huge to me. I loved her. And I love Dixie too, still, of course, but I had no problems with Tiny whatsoever. She became like a favorite of mine. And then later they made her tall anyway, but that's a whole different can of worms. So that kind of sucked for me. I was like, oh, but at least Dixie is now canonically because Dixie's the older sister, but she's still shorter than Tiny. So
right.
Dixie gets to be the actual short one.
Yeah,
so
Dixie is just genetically short. Tiny had a growth spurt and became super tall. Yeah.
But so I love Tiny. Secret fact about me is that I played the saxophone, and I chose to play the saxophone when I was in 6th grade because of Tiny Kong. And Chunky, obviously, one of my favorite Kongs that there is. He's just, I love the kind of like not very smart, but extremely sweet big boy archetype. That's just one of my favorite type of characters. He's like the Kronk from the Emperor's New Groove of the Kongs. He's the himbo, and I love his animation where he's doing the idle animation and all the butterflies land on him. It's just like, he's such a pure soul. I love him to pieces.
Yeah.
And then Lanky's there.
Oh, come on.
Lanky is there.
No.
No, I love Lanky. I love Lanky Kong. He's such a weirdo. It's like, What were they? I don't know. He just came out of complete left field, and I appreciate that.
I appreciate that Lanky does not have an equivalent where you could say, oh, but I prefer that character, because Lanky is so unique in the cast of like playable Kongs, or just the Kong family in general. And I appreciate that we have a good heroic orangutan after Manky Kong. It's nice to see. I always like when they come back later and they're like, okay, but here is a good version of what we previously like deigned an antagonistic like animal class. Like I always like Crunch or K Lumsy seeing like a good natured Kremling. I like that. It's not like, oh, they're not all evil, it's just politics. There's actually like really good-hearted Kremlings, or Kremlings that could be persuaded to ally with the Kongs. So yeah, like Lanky was the only one in 1999 where I never felt like, oh, I wish this was somebody else, because I did kind of mourn the absence of Dixie and Kitty for a bit, although I did appreciate that they established that Tiny is Dixie's younger sister and Chunky is Kitty's older brother. Like they didn't forget them, at least in the literature, in the instruction manual. So that kind of made it more accessible for me. Like it kind of made me appreciate them while not getting so bent out of shape that these characters I was anticipating were going to be in this game actually weren't. And Chunky, of course, he brought his own flavor that I don't think Kitty would have provided unless they aged up Kitty, which, you know, Nintendo or Rare, they're not shy about altering the Kongs if need be. But for me, like Chunky being, just like you said, the himbo who's good-natured but also a bit of a coward and really doesn't want to be doing this. Like, my favorite thing about Chunky is the animation in the tag barrel where he pleads with you not to select him. That is such a rare sensibility. That's such a rare like, touch that is just like, yeah, like having a video game character who does not want to be in that video game. I love it.
Yeah. This is kind of a tangent, but I always liked how Tiny and Chunky seem to have this close friendship, like on this image that you're using here on the stream.
Oh yeah.
You can just kind of barely see it, but like Tiny is like riding on Chunky's hand, and like in the credit scene, they're playing around with each other in the tag barrel. Tiny wants to be selected and Chunky doesn't. So he's like, Tiny, he's like trying to get you to choose her instead.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It's just like they have these little hints of having an especially close friendship. And I just always thought that was super cute.
Yeah. I like that, like the Dixie Kong side of the Kongs, like that whole little like family cluster of those four Kongs, Dixie and Tiny.
Yeah, they're cousins.
Yeah,
so.
Dixie and Tiny and Chunky and Kitty. You've got this whole little like familiar bond between them, and it makes them unique. And you'd see that carry over then in things like Diddy Kong Racing DS, where Diddy enlisted his girlfriend and her sister. So there was just this kind. I like seeing stuff like that. That kind of thread weaving is always appreciated by me. And yeah, like Tiny, I think she does have her own character that's unique from Dixie. She's, in my mind, I read her more as like the hippie kind of like, I don't know, between her and Dixie, I think Dixie is like the pure adventurer, like the adrenaline junkie, while Tiny is maybe a little bit more laid back and a little bit more earthy than Dixie. I don't know.
It's because of the flower.
The flower
on her.
The clothes she wears. She wore like the 60s throwback clothes, which were kind of
beanie
in vogue in the 90s. Yeah. So, like.
But she also does the taxes.
She does.
So she may be laid back hippie, but she does the taxes.
The weird German website. We can't forget the German website for Donkey Kong 64 was established. All sorts of weird facts that some are very dubious and others I'm fine to adopt into my personal headcanon.
Speaking of weird personal headcanons or things that are technically canon by some measure, the Japanese version of DK64 states that K Lumsy is K. Rool's brother, which I still don't know how I want to feel about that personally. I don't know how I feel about that. I only learned that a few years ago and it kind of upended my entire universe.
Yeah, I don't know if that works as well. Just because I think it raises more questions than adds to the canon, personally speaking. But,
Yeah.
because I like, why isn't his name, like something else rule? Why is it Lumsy? I mean, I guess Kremlin naming conventions.
In Japanese, that would make sense.
That's true. That's true.
The K is first.
You got me there. Okay. I'm thinking from the Rare perspective and not the Japanese perspective, which would make sense then why they would jump to that conclusion, though. So, yeah. But yeah, like, I also like some of the NPCs in the game. Like, I feel like it gets a little bit too Banjo-Kazooie-y in the expanded cast for some of these characters, but that being said, like, Troff and Scoff are weirdos, and I can't help but appreciate them in a way that maybe Professor Chops has taken longer to grow on me than...
yeah, Professor Chops should have tried the nipple rings.
Yeah. The nipple rings add a lot once you see them in the game. Like, they removed them from the renders, even though some of the renders with the nipple rings did make their way out. But once you look at their in-game models and you see that they have nipple rings in-game, you can't unsee it. And it completely, like, alters your perception of Troff and Scoff from that point on. But yeah, like, it's one of those touches that's a very rare touch where there's no reason for these characters to exist. You force feed one bananas so they gain weight, so the other can reach the key to unlock the boss fight. Like, what? What?
Yeah, it's probably my, like, favorite example in any video game ever of completely arbitrary gating. Like, they could have just had some kind of magical banana gate, but no, let's have a duo of characters where one of them you have to force feed so he gains weight rapidly, and the other one is just so he can reach his tiny little pig arms to reach a key. It's like, okay.
It's so absurd, and it is like taking the Greg Malesian design philosophy of, well, what if we have a character serve this function rather than it just be this very boring, like, menu text? Because it does make you more invested to have a character you can visit and interact with, and it's more fun and engaging for you, the gamer, than just, at least, I guess it depends on who you are, but I think it's something that Rare fans gravitate to. And it's taking that notion and just making it the most absurd, like, final end game of that. Like, they do not have to be characters. It could just be a magical banana gate. You don't even need B Locker. You know, you could just have, like, oh, this is this gate, this portal says you need 60 golden bananas. You don't need this weird, sassy talking plank of wood giving you crap. But I appreciate that he's there.
Is B Locker related to Planker from Ukulele? Have we ever talked about that?
We've never talked about that. Platonic hasn't really dipped their toes in that water yet. It's not like the unnamed goldfish in Dr. Puzz's bowl where it's like, yeah, it's supposed to be, we just can't say it. You know. I think, again, maybe the Nintendo factor, they're more afraid to step on Nintendo's IP toes, and with Rare, it's just kind of this unspoken understanding. It's like, yeah, you know where we came from. It's fine. Nobody's gonna get upset about this, or nobody's gonna make this legally actionable. It's fine.
So here's the interesting thing about the NPCs is you said that they got to be a little too Banjo-Kazooie-esque, and
in my opinion,
it's interesting. Yeah, because, like, I see where you're coming from, but on the other hand, it's like they didn't go far enough, because a lot of these characters don't have names. They've had to be given names by the fandom. And it's like every character in Banjo-Kazooie, every single one has a name.
Yeah. And
they tell you what their name is most of the time. But here it's just like, oh, that's the owl that lives in the tree. Okay, that's the rabbit that we all hate. Like, I feel like they should have... It makes the world feel kind of empty because there are these characters, but they don't really have names. They just sort of exist as, this is one thing that I do have as a criticism of DK64, whereas the worlds of Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie feel very alive, And here it feels a little bit more artificial. Like, these characters exist, but they don't really feel real in the way that, like, someone like, you know, Naughty from Banjo-Kazooie, who just wants to get into his house, and he tells us his name, and he waits there all seasons until he's able to get in, and, you know.
Yeah.
Instead, it's just like, oh, I guess this is a Neki, I guess, that we save, and then he wants to race us immediately? Okay.
It's funny you bring that character up, because that's the character that Jeff always rants about when Donkey Kong 64 comes up, because he's like, that is to Jeff the epitome of where Donkey Kong 64 goes wrong. It's like, what is that? Is it supposed to be a Neki? Why do I care? This sucks.
I think I might have heard him rant about that before, which might be why that bird is top of mind for me.
Yeah, the bird Donkey Kong website DK Vine called Scaver, because we gave all the characters names because we couldn't abide a Rare game not naming the characters. It was so antithetical to what we believed about Rare. Like, I even wrote a letter to Scribes about it. I was like, what the hell? What the hell? Where are the character names? Where are the biographies?
Banjo-Kazooie has a Naughty with more personality than any of the Naughties in DK64.
It's sad but true. I think it is something that's really apparent to me, like replaying Tooie on NSO right now, is how fleshed out the world of Banjo-Tooie is. Even if you don't like the world of Banjo-Tooie, it feels real and it feels plausible and tangible. And I'm not just talking about how interconnected the Isle of Hags is, but just the characters who reside in it. They all have their little thing. They all have their little lives that they're leading. Even if those lives are stupid and nonsensical, you still kind of buy into it. Same thing with Banjo-Kazooie. But Donkey Kong 64, yeah, it's just like, here's this weird frozen tomato ghost thing sitting.
My favorite thing about the frozen tomato ghost is that he is on a first name basis with Lanky. Now, we don't know what his name is.
They're all on
but he's just like, hey, Lanky, my bestie, let's play a game.
That's the other thing. We don't know any of these characters' actual identities, but they all know the Kongs. They're like, hi, Tiny. Hi, Chunky. Like, how do you know? How do you know who this is?
I guess they live on Donkey Kong Island for the most part, so they probably know the important Kongs.
Yes, but it's weird. It's like, nobody should know who Lanky is at this point. Like, Lanky...
Yeah, where'd this guy come from?
Lanky is just this dude who got kind of roped into this. Like, he's a joke at this point. Nobody should know who this guy is, and yet they're all like, hi, Lanky! Like, who are you? Like, like... You're like some sort of like weird like rock creature or rocks like pillar. Like what are you talking about? How do you know who these characters are? Donkey and Diddy, that makes sense. There's a long history there, but yeah. I think this is mostly an artifact of how rushed the game was and how everybody was scrambling to get it done. Like Chris Seaver designing the tadpole in Gloomy Galleon, who we named Glower. Kind of 11th hour. And I think it was just like, we've got to get the game shipped. Nintendo's going to have our asses if this game isn't ready. And I think by the point they were like done and they had to pull Stop and Swap out of it at the last minute, I think they just couldn't be bothered. Like, ordinarily that would probably fall to Lee Love Day, even like on like after the fact, like we're going to name these characters. It's like, what does it matter? You know, we got to get this information to the players' guides, and we don't have time to name them, so we're just not going to name them. And at this point, who cares? Well, we cared. Obviously, the fans cared. And so I wrote that letter to Scribes, and Lee Loveday was just like, yeah, whatever you call them, it's fine. We're not going to name them. It just feels so contrary to the Rare MO. I mean, to this day, honestly, like, I know like the Sea of Thieves NPCs aren't as like necessarily memorable or interesting as the freaks from the 3D platformers, but they all have names. They all have identities and weird little quirks. So it's just this like weird blemish on that perfect record of really building out a fleshed out game world. And what is fleshed out in Donkey Kong 64 is really just what carries over from the Super Nintendo and Game Boy games.
Mm-hmm.
And a little bit of like the N64 game. Like, you know, the critters have Crunch's vest in this game, which I appreciate that little detail. But what I do like about the worlds in this game is the ambiance of some of them. Because I talk about the more cartoony tone of this game and how it just doesn't feel like an actual evolution from where the Super Nintendo trilogy left off. Even if, yeah, Donkey Kong Country 3 was trending in that more cartoony direction, there was still kind of this... I don't know, quiet solitude, this like solemn tone that it could take when you're not talking to bears named after the band members from ABBA. It still had some of that kind of tenor that the original Donkey Kong Country had. And I think Evelyn...
Yeah, DKC3 is just full of like natural beauty. The waterfall levels, the canyon levels, the like lake levels with a mountain reflected in the background. It's just like, if you just like were to look at the backgrounds of the game, it's fits in right with the others. In terms
I
of
do think a lot
like
of
more realistic.
Yeah, I think a lot of Evelyn Novakovic's soundtrack does kind of. I know like people go to the still, like the boardwalk music, and they're like, that feels wrong. That doesn't feel like Donkey Kong music.
I love the boardwalk music. Haters, I will throw hands with people. It's the first level of a game. It's okay to be goofy. I love the music. Anyway. and
it's like a very pleasant resort. Like it's not supposed to feel disorienting yet, but like I think about the overworld, I think about the cliffs music, the waterfall music, the choral music, and I'm just like, yeah, like that's proper mood setting for a Donkey Kong game. But Donkey Kong 64, maybe because Grant Kirkhope was doing the soundtrack and he was mostly known for Banjo-Kazooie at that point. I don't know, it's weird because Jungle Japes, I would say, for me, personally speaking, Jungle Japes, Gloomy Galleon, and I know a lot of people don't like that world, but just stick with me, and Crystal Caves, they all more or less feel like proper Donkey Kong worlds would, or should, or how you would think they should feel. Frantic Factory made me a bit as well, although it's a bit weird that it's a toy factory. It still kind of has that vibe. Angry Aztec, Fungi Forest, and Creepy Castle, to me, those feel more like Banjo-Kazooie worlds. And I know that tracks with Fungi Forest, given its origins as Fungus Forest, but yeah, I don't know, like, and there are areas, there are corners of each of those worlds where I'm like, this feels like a Donkey Kong world. But it's just what unites it all that makes it feel a little bit more tonally off balance to what you would expect from DK64.
Yeah, I would agree with those assessments. But side note, I wanted to mention this earlier when we're talking about things that we do really love about the game. And I realize the tone is different from the soundtracks of the SNES games, but man, this was my intro to Grant Kirkhope's music, and I just love the DK64 soundtrack so much. I don't know. He released that. Did you listen to the album that he...
I'm glad you brought this up because I wanted to reiterate, even though I talk about how the soundtrack does give it a different sort of aesthetic, audible aesthetic than the Donkey Kong Country trilogy had, I still really like the soundtrack to Donkey Kong 64. And the DK Isles overworld theme, absolute classic. I think it is like up there, maybe in my top 10 Donkey Kong tracks. It has to be that because it really does a wonderful job of setting the mood for that overworld. The overworld itself in Donkey Kong 64 is kind of sparse, kind of half-baked, but so much of it is carried by that song, that Grant Kirkhope song. And yeah, the Materia Collective's Rare Treats Donkey Kong 64 Revisited, that Grant Kirkhope went back, rearranged the Donkey Kong 64 tracks. It is now available to stream on all major streaming platforms. The actual physical release was pushed back. You can pre-order it on vinyl or CD, but it won't ship till early next year. But yeah, that is incredible. I've listened to some of it, but not all of it because I kind of don't want to spoil it to myself because I did pre-order it and I kind of want to get the full experience when it arrives in the mail. But I listened to a few of those tracks and I was like, oh, this is great. This is actually improving upon the original in a way that I normally don't like. I don't like when you alter the classics in any way. Like,
yeah.
But this actually, I think it takes it above and beyond.
Right. So he did a really cool thing, which I appreciate a lot, which is basically every track loops twice. And the first one is played pretty straight. It's pretty much just like more or less the original song, but with higher fidelity sounds. But then on the second loop, he starts experimenting a bit more and you get sort of more of a remix of it. And there's always like a climactic part in each song where it like really hits and he does some really cool stuff. So it's a great album. It just was released a few days ago to stream and I listened through the whole thing. And I also pre-ordered it. So I'm excited to get that eventually. But yeah, really, really cool stuff. There's also a fresh take on the DK rap, which I've seen a lot of divided opinions on, but that's the DK rap. And we can do a whole podcast about just the DK rap by itself. So
you know, the DK rap, I'll say this much. That wasn't Grant Kirkhope's idea. That was George Andreas who pushed for it. And, you know, it's one of those corny cornerstones of our fandom that you just can't help but embrace. It's not like it's something that I'm ashamed of. It's not something that I'm like, why did they do that? It exists. I'm kind of glad it exists for all of its absurdity. I remember how like scandalous it was. Ooh, they said hell. They said hell in a Nintendo game? What?
Yeah.
And then Conquer comes out, you know, like 15 months later, 16 months later, and it's just like, oh, how quaint we were back then.
Yeah, I was always scared my parents were going to take the game away from me because of the swear, but I don't know. They seemed to not really care. I guess they were just like, well, that's the only one. This British game, they're a little out there, I guess.
I remember when I was like younger and like something I was into or like whatever, like a comic book would have a swear in it. I was like, I can't let my parents see this. I like this.
Yeah, I know.
Squirrel this away.
I know they watched the whole DK rap like when we first played the game, but then every time after that, if I was playing and they were in the room or something, I would always skip past it before it got to the chunky part because I was like, did they forget there's swearing in this game? If they see it again, I'm going to be in trouble.
By that point, I was a teenager, so it wasn't like they were going to take it away from me. Like, it's a good thing, too, because I can't imagine like playing Banjo-Tooie and flying over Pterodactyl Land as a kid and them seeing the phallic shapes in the landmass and what they would say there, or just really any of the jokes in Banjo-Tooie that I can't believe they got away with.
Yeah, don't look at Jolly's menu too closely when
Although
your parents are around.
I don't know how filthy my parents' minds actually are. I think they're pretty isolated, like insular lives they lead. They don't know euphemisms. They don't know British slang terms for copious amounts of sailor on sailor sex in the year 2000. But yeah, like the worlds, I love existing in the worlds of Donkey Kong 64. Like I said, Gloomy Galleon, I think like hits so many tones that are just absolutely spot on. Like it really has some Donkey Kong Country 2 nostalgia baked into it. And I love just residing in the world. I just don't like playing it as much. So it's one of those things where I can run around in Donkey Kong 64 and be perfectly content, but when I actually have to get a golden banana in some of these areas, that's where I'm just like, ugh, really? Another bonus stage? Ugh.
Yeah. Gloomy Galleon, I like the atmosphere. I like the music. Actually playing it is atrocious. It is by far the low points of the game, in my opinion.
But even then, like in the most bothersome worlds, I love those long hallways with the swinging lanterns, Courtney. It's one of my favorite flourishes of Donkey Kong 64, where like the lighting effects, they knew they had something going with those lighting effects, and they really, really just embellish them. They went all in on showing those off, but I'm glad they did.
Hey, speaking of Gloomy Galleon, why do you think Lanky has a particular bond with Ungard, such as that he turns into him?
I don't think they thought that through. I think...
Well, of course they didn't, but I think it's just because he was blue. Like, he's the blue one.
I think that was the extent to it was, like Lanky's color, the color of his collectibles, his overalls. He's blue, and Gar is blue. It's fine. We need a Kong to transform into him. It does bug me that you can't ride the animal buddies in Donkey 64, because... The thing is, right, they had the animal transformation crates, which, no, there were animal transformation barrels. The crates house the actual animal that you then rode on. Why are you combining them? Ah!
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because they already had transformation barrels in this game for the Kongs, like, power-ups. They could have just done that with animals.
I mean, the animal buddies are just kind of an afterthought in the game in general. There's the one bit with Rambi.
For sure.
Actually, 2 bits with Rambi because he comes back in Hideout Helm. There's the bit with Engard. And then there's like bonus games that nobody really played all that much. But yeah, it's really like, I like the role Squawks is given in the game. Like they keep him in there as kind of this like ever-present guide whenever you need exposition rattled off to you or how to do something. He flies down. It's better than Professor Chops, at least. But yeah, I really feel like this is really the start of the animal buddies being de-emphasized in the series. It didn't start with Retro. It started with Rare, and it's a shame because... Mm-hmm. It would have been great to have like a different animal buddy in each world, or just a segment. Like even if we had like 4 animal buddies that you could transform into or ride, that would have been something. Like it would have, I think, broken up the worlds a little bit more. Like put Squitter in Fungi Forest. I don't know, do something with that.
Squitter should have had to fight the other spider that is in Fungi Forest.
Yeah, that's why I made that correlation, I think. It just works. And I don't know. It just makes the game feel a little bit less like Donkey Kong to have that de-emphasized role for the animal buddies. And it just would have been nice. I mean, I'm glad Rambi and Engard and Squawks and Lower the Tadpole are in there, but... it would have been nice to have more. Would have felt more like a Donkey Kong game.
Andre says that the reason that Lanky and Ungard share a bond is because they bond over the shared life experience of their overlong body parts. I like that. I also always liked, I don't know, Ungard's always like smiling. He's always got his mouth open, and it seems like he would just have a really positive reaction to whatever antics Lanky was doing, whatever jokes he was telling. That I feel like they could maybe just get along because Ungard's always actually laughing at Lanky's jokes. So I don't know. I have to justify this in my head somehow.
It's also possible because the German website said that Lanky Kong was from Utan Island, and we've kind of headcanoned that could be the island that Orangutan Gang is on in Donkey Kong Country, just off the coast of Vine Valley. So maybe Lanky gets to the main island by riding Engard back and forth. And
yeah. Ungard met this cool orangutan over there and was like, hop on, I can take you to a better place.
Oh yeah, you're not one of those shit orangutans. You've actually got some class with your clown nose that you wear. You insist on wearing. And the little patch on your ass. Is that supposed to be like a pajama, like pooping hatch? Or is that just like he somehow kept falling on his ass enough that he had to get a patch for his overalls?
I always thought it was like because he inflates himself like a balloon and he's got to let the air out somehow. So like when it makes like the farting noise, like the patch would open up slightly. I know that's not animated, but that's what I always imagined it was there for.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, it makes more sense than Chunky's weird 2-tone vest.
Yeah. And his belt that isn't holding up any pants.
I mean, that makes sense. The Kongs generally don't wear pants, but sometimes you want that belt as an accessory. I understand that. One thing I really do like about this game are the bosses. And generally speaking, I think the boss fights are mostly fun. And I kind of like the design of most of the bosses.
I love the bosses, except for Puff Toss. I like the boss fight a lot. I really actually enjoy going around and going through those stars. I think it's a lot of fun. But Puff Toss is just a giant puffer fish. He's just a giant puffed up. He's not very exciting.
That is exciting. What are you talking about? That is exciting. He is the boss version of the puffed up. That is a...
Oh, I guess, yeah. He's like the King Zing or the Queen Bee or the very naughty of puffed ups.
We finally got boss versions of an army with Armadillo, of a puffed up with Puff Toss, which is a great name for a boss if you're a puffed up. It kind of falls apart a little bit after, like, you've got Dogadon, who is a literal dragon fly, but we already have dragonflies. We have flitters from DKC2. So are you telling me that this is just like a flitter that actually has dragon DNA? Or like what? So that's a little convoluted. That's a little confused. And then Mad Jack is a evil Jack in the Box, which I guess we've seen they were going to have like Jack in the Box enemies in Frantic Factory, which then Mad Jack would have been the boss version of, but I think they cut those. So there isn't that correlation there. So he's just a giant Jack in the Box for some reason.
Well, he makes sense as the boss of a toy factory. And I love the weird ones the best because Dogadon maybe makes no sense to be a boss in a Donkey Kong game, but he has such a cool design. Like
He does.
I feel like being a literal dragonfly and having both dragon and insectoid elements is something that you don't actually see that often, despite the obvious pun.
Right.
And he's such a cool take on that concept. And I love that you get to fight him twice. It's like super epic, the way he falls into the lava, but like bursts back out and he's got fire all over him. Oh, he's so cool. And then Mad Jack is just like, what the fuck is up with Mad Jack? He's some kind of like cyborg Kremling thing who has tentacles for hair and he is a Jack in the Box. Like, he's just some kind of weird abomination monstrosity with a red glowing eye and just, I don't know, like he's like from some kind of horror game or something. I just love how out there he is, and it makes you want to come up with his backstory or whatever. Like, how did he get like this? Was he a real live Kremling at some point who got turned into this? Was he just a toy that came to life? What happened?
I do like the implication in Frantic Factory. And of course, this is just me connecting dots that probably weren't ever actually being connected behind the scenes, given the development history of this game and how little George Andreas seemed to really care about Donkey Kong lore to the same extent that weirdos like us did. But I like Frantic Factory because they're making like toy versions of Kremlings and Zingers even. So in my head, it was, they're trying to replenish their ranks after the Crocodile Isle catastrophe. So they're like actually making like clockwork replacements for those they lost when the Crocodile Core backed up and destroyed the island. So, like, there's rationale for Frantic Factory, why they have to be so toyetic and they can't just be, like, actual robots. I don't know. It's a design choice. It's stylistic. But, yeah, Mad Jack, I think he works. It's fine. I could see that boss existing in something like Donkey Kong Country 3 just fine. Honestly, my favorite stupid boss is King Cutout. I love the idea of King Cutout where it is just the Kremlings trying to con you into thinking like, oh, this is K. Rool, but they're doing such a bad job of it. It's so dumb on their part. It's literally a cardboard cutout of King K. Rool. What is this? But it is a boss fight. It doesn't make much sense to be the boss fight of the spooky, haunted castle that's somehow floating in the sky, but nothing about that world makes sense anyway, so why not just have some fun with it?
I have a whole headcanon about Creepy Castle if you want to hear it.
I would love to hear it.
All right, I'll tell you that in a minute, but first, the thing about King Cutout is there's this whole vibe of Creepy Castle in general where it's like they never expected the Kongs to actually get this far. It's the last level. So they didn't have a boss recruited to deal with this level. So they just literally had to cobble something together. They don't even have enough actual spooky creatures to staff this level. So they had to get Kremlings to just wear bed sheets and wander around like ghosts. And that there's that whole vibe of like the Creepy Castle is a genuinely haunted place. It's got the skeleton zombie Kremlings, but it's also got a slight vibe of the haunted house that someone just threw together and is obviously fake. So it manages to balance both those things at the same time, which I think is cool.
Yeah.
My headcanon about Creepy Castle is that, there's like K. Rool's Keep in DKC2,
sure.
But I think before that there was another castle that was on the top of Crocodile Isle, and eventually it just absorbed so much magic from, being built over the core essentially, and the core just kind of going up into it that it just kind of floated off into the sky, and now it's just up there. And then K. Rool was like, well, I have to build another castle now. So, that's just a silly headcanon I came up with years ago.
I mean, it's definitely something along those lines, right? Like there's...
And that's why it's like still there where Crocodile Isle used to be, because when you shoot up to it, it's like across from DK Island, basically. So it's just up there. Now, the real question is why there's a floating island that has fungi forest in it.
Oh, well, I have a headcanon for that.
All right, go.
Okay, so Chimpanzee Clouds and Donkey Kong Land, which floats over Monkey Mountains, and... this isn't established in Donkey Kong Land, but if you go to Donkey Konga 2, you can see the islet off the coast of the Congo jungle that's Big Ape City, and then there's another islet next to it that are mountains, so that would be Monkey Mountains and Big Ape City. So Chimpanzee Clouds would be floating just above that off the coast of Donkey Kong Island. Then Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze established Secret Seclusion, which is a floating landmass off Donkey Kong Island that's being suspended in the air by magic Snowmad runes when the Snowmads had presumably made some incursion in Donkey Kong Island in the past and raised this island, like raised this chunk of land above Donkey Kong Island. So I think that Secret Seclusion, Chimpanzee Clouds, the areas in Donkey Kong Barrel Blast that also have blue like engravings in the floating landmass, and Fungi Forest, they're all the same landmass.
Okay, I like that.
Okay.
I like that.
That's partially Jeff's headcanon too. Jeff and I workshopped that together because we connected the dots there. So you have to give Jeff his shrift there. But yeah, like to your point about the kind of ramshackle nature of the Kremlings, you have the Kremlings just wearing ghost sheets, like the cheapest, crappiest Halloween costume. And who do they think they're fooling? But this is also a game where you do have like genuinely undead Kremlings, where you have like actual ghostly events where Wrinkly Kong appears as a spirit through walls. So you have supernatural events happening in this game, and it's a nice blend of, yeah, you have the fantastical, you have the otherworldly, but the Kremlings can't always meet that threshold, so they've got to fill in the blanks with this nonsense. It makes the game world both very tangible and plausible and down to earth, while also having that outlandish aspect to it, like the minecart demons, as Squawks calls them. They exist. Like the Kremlings do have access to these supernatural forces, but they, I guess, have very limited resources in that realm.
Yeah, and honestly, it kind of is all cohesive and is even maybe a little bit meta and winking at the audience, because like if you read the instruction manual, K. Rool's plan is essentially to waste the Kong's time.
Yeah.
Like he needs to buy time for the machine to charge up again. So he's just like, we're going to put so many collectibles, like we just need to keep them busy. So there was a little bit of cheeky frankness, and I think maybe some of these elements like King Cutout and stuff might have been them saying like, we didn't have time to come up with a better boss, so you just get like K. Rool, but it's in 2D. And that also has the greatest sound effects of all time in any Rare game. Like the greatest sound clips are in that battle. Just, ha-ha, ha-ha, wow! It's like, I can't even imitate them. They're just... But I try. Whenever I play the game, I have to, like... It's like playing Ghoulies. I always have to repeat what the enemies are saying, because it's just so in your face.
I do appreciate that the broken King Cutout is there in the dolphin auditions at the very end of the game.
Oh yeah, what a cursed cutscene.
Yeah.
Cutscene is so strange.
It is strange, but I have grown fond of it over the years when I made the realization that it's effectively the Donkey Kong Jungle Beat auditions, and the reason only Donkey Kong appears in Donkey Kong Jungle Beat is Cranky Kong disqualified everyone else because he was the director of Donkey Kong Jungle Beat.
Yes.
So it retroactively salvages a lot of my complaints about Donkey Kong Jungle Beat as well. So let's talk a little bit, and this is something I'm not familiar with. I don't kind of walk on these paths, but the game's popularity has kind of been renewed a little bit in recent years, thanks to a fan-created asset that apparently improves the experience of playing the game. And you have some experience in this matter. It's the Donkey Kong 64 Randomizer.
Yes. So this is one of the main reasons that I wanted to do this episode with you, is because I have seen this game get a lot of love recently from outside of what you might think of as the typical, old guard rare fandom circles. Because, I mean, there's also the speedruns, but that's a separate thing. But, so are you familiar with randomizers, like, at all? As a concept?
Only tangentially. I know the Idaho crew messed around with them on one of their streams once or twice. I don't know. I can't be bothered half the time. I'm just like, I'm old. I'm very old, so I'm like, just give me a game in my system and I'll play it. I don't want to have to look into, no, I'm tired.
Yeah, no, there is some amount of technical setup involved, although it's not that complicated and there's lots of resources to make it easier. But basically, a randomizer is a mod for a game that takes all of the items in the game and shuffles them around. So I first really gained awareness of them through basically anything that's kind of structured as a Metroidvania works really good for this, but I gained awareness of them through Zelda ones. So, like, there's one for Ocarina of Time that got pretty popular. Basically, I'll just go ahead and jump straight to how it works in DK64. So every item in the game, every golden banana, every banana medal, not the collectible bananas usually, because you need those to get the banana medals, so they need to be in consistent locations. And if you put random stuff on like every place where a colored banana was, that would just be insane. But so basically all of the items are shuffled around. So let's say you did So let's say you're just starting the game up and you walk you usually start out the randomizers with your shockwave ability that you normally get from the Banana Fairy Queen. So like under each dirt patch, instead of there being a rainbow coin, it's something else. So you can go check the one in K. Lumsey's like island cage area, and under there, instead of there being a rainbow coin, there could be a golden banana, there could be a banana fairy, there could be a potion from Cranky, which contains one of the moves that you do not yet have, such as Hunky Chunky or Primate Punch or anything like that. You start out normally with the standard settings with only 2 Kongs, and you have to find the rest of the Kongs, who are also scattered somewhere in the world. All of the entrances or the levels are randomized, so like, you go into the Jungle Japes lobby, but surprise, it's actually Crystal Caves. So you're doing Crystal Caves first, and you're going to have Diddy and Chunky, and you start doing all the things you can do in Crystal Caves with them, but they don't have their instruments and they don't have their guns, so you have to just go around and do all of the things that are open to you until you find things. And then, of course, you can do more and more things. So it becomes this big puzzle where you have to consider, like, what are your options that you can actually do with the resources that you currently have. And the more you find, then the more you can do, obviously. But what prevents you from just eventually going through the whole game and going check by check is there's also hints. And the more golden bananas you get, the more hints you get, and the hints tell you like what paths to follow, essentially. So it turns into this big puzzle, and in order to make the game somewhat shorter, the standard settings, you only have to do 3 phases of K. Rool, and through the hints you find out what those are. So, like, you might only have to do the tiny phase, the lanky phase, and the chunky phase. And you have to find not only those Kongs to beat the game, but any moves that they require to beat K. Rool. So you'd have to find Chunky, and you'd have to find Hunky Chunky and Primate Punch, and Gorilla Gone, which you also need to get into Helm. So there's, like, rules to keep track of, but basically, if you are good at this, like, the top players can beat one of these instances in about an hour and a half, seems to be a good average. And it's just, like, there are people who stream this, and that's what they stream, like, every day, or every time they stream. They just do it over and over and over again. And it's genuinely very fun. It's fun to watch. It's fun to play. And, so I was watching the, like, finale of the season 3 tournament that they were having, and there were like 200 people watching it, which is not setting any kind of esports records or anything, but that's like a decent amount of people to be watching DK64. And there's a Discord for the randomizer that has like 3,000 people in it or more. So, like, it's pretty popular for a completely, you know, like, when you think about this many people thinking about DK64 every single day, like, it's happening. And people have all kinds of inside jokes and memes about this game. And another aspect of it, too, is that you can even, like, customize the music. And that's something I've been doing for the past half year or so, is making custom music for DK64. So you can play the game and you're listening to music from, like, Banjo-Kazooie when you're in the DK Isles, or you're listening to music from Super Mario 64 where you're in Fungi Forest. And, yeah, that's basically it. It's a very, very cool thing. And there are a lot of passionate fans who are working on this, whether they're programmers, whether they're people who do commentary on the races, whether they're people making music. There's this whole community out there. And, it really just warms my heart that people keep games like DK64 alive and eternally fresh by doing stuff like this.
That is cool. I mean, honestly, just the way the Jinjo's randomized in Banjo-Tooie is a bit much for me. So I like the consistency. So this almost sounds like it would give me anxiety, like not having any semblance of what to expect in Donkey Kong 64. Like, I think the way you pitched it just now, yes, that would be a very, very fun streaming experience. But just as my personal, like, absorption of, like, replaying a game, I would rather just try to figure out what the deal with the ghost tomato is for the upteenth time. But yeah, like,
no, it's just, that's why I wanted to bring it up, because, like, there's a very specific way that I think the fandom circles that you're in approach stuff like this, and that's totally, you know, great. It's more from, like, a just enjoying the game in its vanilla natural presentation. You think about the lore, you think about the game, but then there's, like, this whole other world of people out there who see this game in a different light, but also appreciate it. Because there's something that's really unique about DK64 where it makes a good randomizer because it has so much stuff in it. And all the things that people would have criticized about the game are the very reasons that it's able to be such a rewarding experience in this particular unique context.
Oh, for sure.
There's even, there's even things about the game which are kind of baffling originally that the randomizer devs made work to their advantage. Like, you know how you go to where K. Rool has his chair in Hideout Helm, and behind him, for some reason, there's just, like, a picture of all 5 Kongs, like their faces that he has on the wall. Yeah. And why are those there? I don't know. Doesn't make any sense. But if you manage to get to that point, you don't have enough hints telling you what Kongs need to, like, fight K. Rool in your particular instance of the randomizer. Like, it'll show you because it'll only have those 3 there. So, like, it might have DK, Diddy, and Chunky there. And that means those are the 3 Kongs who have to fight K. Rool. Like, there's just so many little details that they were able to work with in this massive game to make it into this new puzzle experience, and it's kind of insane.
No, it definitely sounds intriguing, and the way you just pitch it now, I think, won me over to justifying its existence. I think you're right. Like the way I approach games, the way I get into games, it's all about taking the product as intended or released by the developers and sort of celebrating and elevating that, and like getting into the world as is, where like augmenting it, changing it is kind of like desecration for me, but that said, when I was a kid, I loved messing with games with my Game Genie or Game Shark, so I definitely get it. I think if I had more time, if I wasn't actually doing DK Vine, I think DK Vine's a big part of what holds me back from really exploring stuff like that, because my day job is Donkey Kong, the DKU, and so when I actually have some downtime, the last thing I want to do is to be playing or experimenting with any of this. Like, I need to just unplug. So, yeah, if I had the free time I used to, and this was my escape, then I could definitely see trying this out and seeing if not improves the experience, and at least shakes it up and keeps it persistently interesting.
Yeah. So if anyone out there listening is interested, you could just go to dk64randomizer.com and, check it out. Anyway, speedruns are also a separate thing. I just want to talk about them for just a couple minutes. But speedrunning obviously is, I feel like, it's been a huge thing on like Twitch and streaming communities for a very long time. But I feel like its popularity in general is kind of on the decline right now, and stuff like randomizers and different challenge runs are sort of in their ascension, whereas speedrunning in general, it's still popular, but maybe not as popular as it once was. And I think that's largely because it is a very, it can be very frustrating, and it can sort of lose its luster after a while if you are a runner or even a viewer, to just kind of do the same thing over and over again and then fail and then have to start over from the beginning. Whereas things like randomizers, it is different every time, and there's natural intrigue from that. But DK64 has a very unique speedrun, and it has also gained some notoriety and popularity because of that. And it's been at like GDQs and stuff, because this game can technically be beaten from a fresh file that has nothing on it in like under 30 minutes. And it uses manipulation from the way the cutscenes work, and it's like, there's videos on YouTube that explain it, and I highly recommend checking some of them out, because it is very hard to explain, but it's extremely interesting. It has to do with like the way that the intro cutscene runs a timer in the background, and using that to manipulate the way the different types of the, like, I don't know. It's you basically have to manipulate the game to give you items that you shouldn't have yet, like the guns and the different moves, and so you can go to K. Rool as soon as possible and just beat him. And obviously, this is not like actually playing the game in any legitimate sense. I was gonna say, but it's just a fun thing. Yeah, it's just like, it is fascinating though. It's cool to learn about this sort of stuff, because, like I was saying way earlier, there's just so much that goes into the way this game works and the way it runs. And learning how to break it teaches you how the game works and gives you respect for like all of the little intricate details that keep it running in the first place, I think.
Yeah, there is the misnomer out there, widely bandied about, that the whole reason it uses the expansion pack was there was a game-breaking glitch, and it wouldn't run without it, and so they had to package the expansion pack with the game. That's not true, actually. It was bundled with the expansion pack because it needed the expansion pack, and Nintendo agreed it was time to release the expansion pack, but there was no game-breaking glitch. There's lots of great game-breaking bugs that people can exploit with Donkey Kong 64, but that wasn't one of them, just for the record. Yeah, like speedrunning, I understand the appeal. I respect it as an art form, as a way to play the game, but you know me. My whole thing is existing in the game world and savoring the minutia of all the little details. So it's completely antithetical to the way I play games, which is why whenever I stream on our Twitch channel, I call it DK Vine Done Slow, because I'm like, well, you're not getting a speed run from this. You're not even getting me playing the game well. It's really going to be me running around and pointing out all the little details, like, hey, that frozen ghost tomato thing, that's dumb.
Yeah, but like I said, there is a lot of interesting stuff you can learn just about the game and how it's put together that does give you a lot of respect for the technical side of it if you look into this sort of thing. Like, I was watching one of these speedrunning videos earlier because I was familiar with the speedrun, but I didn't really understand how it actually worked. And so, like, I just learned a bunch of cool little details about how the game is programmed. And, for instance, you know how you have to free each of the Kongs in the game?
Yes.
And the game sort of has, like, internal checks to see whether a Kong was freed or not. Technically, the very beginning of the game with the training grounds, that counts as Donkey Kong's prison. And if you, like, glitch out of the training grounds area without hitting the button, it acts as if DK hasn't been freed until you, like, if you glitched into being another Kong and you went into the tag barrel, DK would just be a question mark, because DK is technically still trapped inside his prison, which is the beginning of the game. So they designed it as if that was his jail and he frees himself. I don't know, it's just little things like that I really love learning about.
Yeah, and that's completely compatible with what I've always argued, was that, yes, that was his prison. They did trap him in there. They kidnapped all 5 Kongs, including Donkey Kong, as part of their stalling.
Yeah, so the game is designed in such a manner that is actually true. Like, that backs up your theory.
Nice. I'm right again, everyone. I'm right about Donkey Kong. Woo! All right, we have 4 calls. Of course, you can always call the DK Vine hotline by dialing 1-202-630-VINE. That is 8463. Give us a call whenever you would like. It's always open, 24 hours a day. However, we, of course, won't play your call if we didn't solicit a open proclamation that we're taking calls for that episode. However, I will squirrel away your calls like a squirrel, like
Nabnut.
Like Nabnut. I will squirrel away your call like a nut in winter and save it for a future Callsack episode, a future occasion to play it. But we got 4 calls about Donkey Kong 64 on this one, so why don't we go ahead and play the first one?
Hey, this is Garthu again. I don't know if you remember, but I'm the guy who was terrified of Mecha Grunty as a child, so that's fun. But I'm here to call because I wanted to say I really, really love Donkey Kong 64. I actually, for the first time, I played it past the first level last year because as a kid, I had Donkey Kong 64 and Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Advance, and back then, I barely even knew that Donkey Kong was related to Nintendo, because those were the 2 games I had, and I never really had any Mario games, so I always just knew him as a Rareware IP. So it was really fun to finally play that last year, and it made me realize that a lot of the sound effects, especially like I noticed like Diddy Kong's dying sound effect, came from Donkey Kong 64 when they made the Donkey Kong Country GBA game, which I never realized till now. So that was interesting, but I have a lot of good memories of the game because I played at a very, very early age. My brother and sister would often hand me the controller, and most of my memories are just dying repeatedly, and of course the DK rap, which was instilled at me at like the age of 3. I totally understand why people find the character pads annoying, like I get it, but it never really it never really took down the game for me in the same way it does for other people. I still found it really fun. I love the platforming challenges. I love all the mini games. I love the bosses. It just has a lot of charm. It's really interesting hearing, Grant Kirkhope's version of a Donkey Kong soundtrack. Tiny Kong, Lanky Kong, and Chunky Kong are all really fun characters. I especially love the detail that Chunky is like the one that doesn't want you to pick him in the character select. And yeah, the DK Island and Funky Shop themes are also really big favorites of mine. So I kind of just wish more people gave the game love. So I'm happy that there are other people who do. Thanks.
Well, thank you for the call. I brought up a good point, too, that we haven't touched upon, is that Donkey Kong 64 really dictated the direction of Donkey Kong for about 5 years after the game came out. And I think it was always going to a certain extent, even if Rare had stayed partnered with Nintendo, because you look at some of the stuff like Donkey Kong Racing's trailer, and you see like elements of Donkey Kong 64 within it. I think they were going for maybe more of a distillation between like the aesthetics of Donkey Kong 64 and the Donkey Kong Country and Land games and Diddy Kong Racing to a certain extent. They were trying to like harmonize all of it in the GameCube era, which never happened. But then we got the Game Boy Advance remake trilogy, which borrowed heavily from Donkey Kong 64, as did Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color. But then even from the Nintendo side of things, Donkey Kong 64 was the last major Donkey Kong game they had to go off of when they started incorporating the Rare elements. And so you would get things like Grant Kirkhope as Donkey Kong and Chris Sutherland as Diddy being used for the sound clips for a good long while in like Mario sports games. And then you would have like the Donkey Kong 64 design of the critters in Mario Power Tennis, for example. So it's always cool to see before they kind of redid a lot of the designs in the like, halfway point of the aughts, when I think DKKO Swing was really when we started to see those new designs replace the older ones. And of course, then the Kongs got new voice clips, and that stuff was kind of retired finally, but it persisted a surprisingly long time.
Yeah, and you pointed out the Funky theme, which is a great piece of music, and I thought about bringing this up earlier. You've probably talked about this plenty before, but like Funky's weird military gun nut arc, which is completely out of character, but it did lead to this piece of music, which is where Grant combined this sort of like military jingle with a really funky beat, and it's such a very unique song that is just really, really good. That's like the one thing I like out of this whole weird arc that Funky had.
I justify the weird arc as Funky isn't really a gun nut per se, because one, his weaponry is non-lethal fruit-based weaponry, okay? So
True.
It's not like he's, arming children with AK-47s or whatever. Two...
He does have like a legit machine gun in his shop, though.
Yeah, okay, but Funky is also a mechanic. He is kind of the James Bond Q to the Kongs, where he's always giving them, upgrades and gadgetry and vehicles. And so I could see him really getting into the technical aspect of this, like, artillery, especially as it's not lethal. So it kind of walks the line very, very closely as being out of character, but I don't think it crosses it.
Yeah, I see that. I never really thought about it from that angle before, that he's specifically trying to arm them with, like organic, non-lethal weapons.
Organic, non-GMO ammunition, right, yeah. He's a laid-back, peace-loving dude. At the end of the day, you're not actually murdering the Kremlin. I mean, you murdered enough Kremlins in DKC too. It's time to just like knock them out with some coconuts and peanuts and what have you. Grapes.
Yes.
Grapes.
Although if one of them has a peanut allergy, that might be a problem.
That is true. I hadn't considered that. And then, just the amount of crimes Diddy has committed against Kremlin kind inadvertently. He's shooting them with the peanuts. Oh, it'll be fine. And then they go into shock, and Diddy never knows the trauma he's caused. But before we move on to the second call, I'll just say I still think of Donkey Kong as a Rare IP. You're not going to change my mind on that. It is still one of the core pillars of Rare's intellectual property. Even if they don't own it, I don't care. It'll always be theirs, more or less. Thank you for the call. Okay, let's play our second call.
Hey, DK Vine, it's Ray Day Pinball. I heard you're doing an episode about Donkey Kong 64. I figured I'd call in since it's one of the rare Fab Five, as I call them, the N64 games that I guess I grew up with. And, I still like playing DK64. In my mind, it's got a lot of flaws as an actual game, but if you just kind of turn your brain off and just enjoy the ride, crank up the music and just kind of just zone out for a while, it's fun. It's just good old-fashioned running around as monkeys, listening to Grant Kirkhope. There's some cool characters. There's some great scenery. It's just a nice little escape. And I still play it to this day. So I don't think it gets enough credit for just being just existing, It's fun. Could it have been better? Yes. I wish the Kongs, it wasn't like a picture of a Kong, so you're like, oh, I guess I need the Kong with the face, Oh, it's a picture of Chunky Kong, I better get Chunky Kong. Like, it'd be cool if they would have made it so you could solve things multiple ways, or like less obvious ways where you're like, oh, I could do this as Diddy, but it'd be much easier as Tiny Kong, that sort of thing. Or if the barrel abilities, you could use them without a barrel, so it'd be kind of like Banjo-Kazooie where you have this arsenal of moves, but you kind of got to remember to use them and kind of, like, ooh, do I want to shrink down to size here? Does that help me? That sort of thing. But it doesn't, and that's fine. It's just the way it is. And like I said, you just have to go in it knowing that and just enjoy the ride. Yeah, that's all I got to say about DK64.
Well, thank you for the call, Ray Day Pinball. Yeah, there is kind of a brutal design philosophy to Donkey Kong 64 where it's very, unless you break the game with bugs and glitches, falling through walls and what have you, there is a very set way to do nearly everything. And I think that's probably one of the biggest frustrations and drawbacks with it. But I also think Ray Day is right. If you just don't think about it, it's fine. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm eagerly anticipating it coming to NSO. Not as much as I am Diddy Kong Racing, but I think that having it on NSO with those save states, with the ability to just play it in handheld mode, like it did for Banjo-Tooie, or has been doing for Banjo-Tooie for me, it's really going to elevate it above all of the annoyances that existed on its native hardware.
Yeah, and something about, it being a brain-off game. There are some things in it that are challenging, but for the most part, it is very straightforward. And, yes, you see something with the Kong's face on it, and you just got to go back to the tag barrel, get the Kong, bring them over here, and it's easy to figure out what to do. And I think that's why it is kind of a comforting game to a lot of people, because it's just a checklist of tasks that are all fairly straightforward. And when you replay the game, you just kind of, this is for better or for worse, right? Obviously, some people would find this to be terrible, boring gameplay, but some people find it just it's fun to revisit it because you don't have to think too hard about it, and you just get to kind of just vibe and enjoy these worlds and this music and just do all the stuff. And it's nice to have a game where the progress is so you're constantly checking things off your list. I got another golden banana. I got another banana medal. I got another banana fairy. And you just kind of go and you see the progress add up. And something like Banjo-Tooie, which I think is a much, much, much better designed game. It has a lot of actual brilliance. If you look at something, say, like Grunty Industries, the way that level is put together is immensely complicated, but very clever. But you have to think about it a lot. And I think that's why a lot of people might struggle with something like Banjo-Tooie, but embrace something like DK64, because again, for better or worse, it is a much more straightforward experience.
Yeah. And I think, people hold up Donkey Kong 64. It's like the game that broke collectathons, right? It ruined them forever. I think that's hyperbole. I think that's not necessarily true. I think it was probably one collectathon too many for the N64, and at least the way they went about it. But I think in isolation, it's perfectly fine. I think that, my own disappointments aside, it is possible to get into Donkey Kong 64 on its own merits and have a good time. Not everything has to be held up against some other thing. Not everything has to be held up against the game design philosophy, like the one true way to make video games. This is the way to do it. This fails, ergo it's a bad game. You can look at Donkey Kong 64 as a flawed work of art and still appreciate it and still have fun with it. It doesn't say anything about you, a person, if you can get into this game and have a really good time, because it is possible, because it does have redeeming qualities. It is a fun game to just exist in sometimes. And I think we all get too worried about critical consensus and being on the right side of history. I know we at DK Vine worried about it. And life's too short. And if this brings you joy, that's great. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. Have at it. Yep.
And that's why I replay it 101% every year.
I will definitely try to play it more religiously when it comes to NSO. I think my biggest problem is I don't have my N64 hooked up. I know that sounds wild that I don't have my N64 hooked up, but space is limited, so like when it came to the Wii U, I was like, yes, I can play Donkey Kong 64 a lot more on the regular. Playing it on the Wii U was kind of a miserable experience for a lot of different factors. I'm not going to hold it against Donkey Kong 64. It was just the way that Rare designed it to function on the N64 didn't translate on the Wii U. Like the speed of certain things, like the Mad Jack fight, for example. Like there was deliberate design for the slowdown on the N64 that did not exist on the Wii U. So I am kind of cautious. There have been a couple things in Banjo-Tooie where I'm like, I can't play this in handheld mode. I need to put it in the dock and use my N64 Switch controller to actually do this. Like every little bit in Banjo-Tooie where you have to sneak, where you have to tiptoe, I can't do it in handheld mode because the stick is too slick and I can't actually get a good tiptoe going with Banjo. I just immediately start like walking at a brisk pace. So then I put it in the dock. I use the N64 analog stick and it works perfectly. So I feel like having that with Donkey Kong 64 will go a long way towards making the game function the way I remember it functioning. So I'm really looking forward to it when it does happen, if it happens, but it's going to happen, right? They're putting everything on NSO. NSO is sticking around. It's just a matter of time. So yeah. Thank you for the call, Ray Day. Let's take our third call.
Hi, Hyle and Courtney. It is I, Scooter. Unlike my last call, which I made at 4 a.m. and extremely off the cuff, for this one I'm actually writing out my thoughts ahead of time. So, Donkey Kong 64. This game was actually my first Donkey Kong. My family did not have a SNES when I was growing up. I had played DKC a few times at a friend's house, but I never really got to spend a lot of time with it. I did have an N64, and I first experienced the DKU through renting Diddy Kong Racing. I was fully hooked when I got the Banjo-Kazooie promo tape in the mail, and just had to get the game when I realized the main character was the same one in Diddy Kong Racing. It only followed that I also got DK64 and Tooie as they released. Unfortunately, DK64 ended up pushing the idea of a collectathon to its breaking point for me. While I did manage to 101% the game at age 11, with the help of an official player's guide that I still have, it ended up being such a slog towards the end that I put the game down and did not intend to return to it after that. I did come back to it after I got out of college in 2011, where I had a renewed interest in my N64 and its games. I played through DK64 again, part of a second DKU journey I was taking with my then-girlfriend, now spouse. We experienced the ups and downs of DK64 together, again up to 101%. The hard version of Beaver Bother that you play in Creepy Castle like 3 times haunted us both for years to come. After that experience, we agreed that completing the game to 101% twice in my life was enough. I enjoyed the time I had with DK64, but it was time to move on to games that respected my rapidly diminishing free time. Then, about a year ago, I discovered the DK64 Randomizer. I'm sure Courtney has talked about it by now, but I'm going to also. Some very excellent people over at DK64Randomizer.com have worked together to create a whole new way to experience the game. It turns the game into an always-changing logic puzzle with many twists and turns, unexpected outcomes, and tons of quality-of-life mods. They really understand what makes the game special and also what holds it back. Because of this, DK64 is again at the forefront of my gaming here in 2024. I have participated in a few racing tournaments, made some new friends, and it's even the reason I was inspired to buy your Dark Side of the Banana metal shirt. They even let you customize your experience with Kong colors and music. With Kong customization, I've created a small bubble of headcanon on my Twitch channel where Lanky is Luffy from One Piece because they both have stretchy arms, Tiny is Hatsune Miku, and Chunky is a trans icon. Not to get political, but Chunky would totally say trans rights. I'm coming up on my time limit, so I'm going to call back. Hello, again, Scooter here, resuming my call where I was. Anyway, Chunky, trans rights. Courtney has made some excellent music for the Randomizer, including music from various Mario parties, Banjo-Kazooie, and more. I've commented this already on your videos, Courtney, but I really appreciate the work you've put into the music for the DK64 Rando. Anyway, I'm very glad to have DK64 in my life, both as it was originally and as it is now, and I wish it a happy 25th. Let me ask you this, Hyle. Now that you know about the Randomizer, how do you reconcile all of the different adventures that have taken place by people playing it? Are they separate canonical adventures like the country and land games are? Or are they all just a fever dream that DK is having from eating too many bad bananas? Or some crazy third thing that you're about to come up with? Thanks for taking the calls.
Well, thank you for the call, Scooter. Just generally speaking, I don't consider replaying a game in the present day to be canon, per se. So I wouldn't hold any of the Randomizer to be concrete, official canon. But if you want to make it your own headcanon, feel free. There's nothing holding you back from that. I certainly am not going to try to push that Donkey Kong Land 2 is a separate adventure quite as hard as I did in the past, even though in my own personal headcanon of the DKU, it absolutely is a midquel or an interquel between Donkey Kong Country 2 and Country 3. But it's definitely interesting. I kind of want to check out the Randomizer on my own terms, provided I have the time to do so. But the way it has been described to me now by both you and Scooter, it definitely sounds like a completely unique way to experience the game, and one I wouldn't have ever considered on my own.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments on the music. I've had a ton of fun. I dabbled around with music stuff when I was younger. Like I said, I was in band. I played the saxophone, but I haven't really worked with anything musical for like 10 years, and I had such a passionate reaction to seeing all the different DK64 music, but being like, what? They don't have any Mario Party 3 music songs in here? Like, what the heck? So I was like so passionate about it, I learned to do this myself. And then since then, I've made like over 40 songs in the past like half year or so. And it's just something that's brought me a ton of joy to kind of understand how this music works on a technical level and know that I'm making something that other people are enjoying, even when I'm not present, and just being part of this community and being able to contribute in my own way. It's been really, really special, and something that, because I've been a fan artist for so long, but this is something that's new to me, a new way to like express my love for different games. Not only DK64 itself, but the various games that I'm bringing the music into it. It's just been really a great experience that's brought me a ton of happiness and continues to do so.
Have you brought any Grab by the Ghoulies music into the Randomizer?
So here's the deal. It's much easier if you can like rip the MIDI from something and then you just have to do a bunch of editing on it and finding the right instruments in the DK64 sound font and stuff like that, but at least you have something to work with. With Ghoulies, I would have to compose it from scratch. So I actually really do want to make like at least maybe the Baron final battle music. I think that would sound great. It's basically sounds like it could be a DK64 song as it is.
Right. So
I would love to do that. Maybe by next Halloween, I'll have the chops to, I'll have the professor chops to be able to compose that on my own. But, you know, I'm working up to that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for the call, Scooter. Andre points out to my point about replaying a game and it being applicable to the canon. Unless it's an XBLA banjo game, of course. Look, that's different, okay? That was officially released, and they made references to Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts within it. So, between that and the stop and swap connectivity with nuts and bolts, yes, how could it not be anything but the Lord of Games making them re-experience their past adventures? That is not me being off my rocker. That is me approaching this with logic and sensibility. Thank you for the call. Let's play our fourth and final caller, and then we'll wrap this up with, I think, the question that I get asked the most concerning Donkey Kong 64 is, would we like the game to be remade? Ooh, okay. Think on that. Let's play the call.
Hey, Kongversation. This is TJ calling in to talk about Donkey Kong 64. So, yeah, DK64, huge favorite of mine growing up. I was really, really young when we had that game for the Nintendo 64. My Nintendo 64 is actually the green jungle variant that came bundled with DK64. So, yeah, growing up, I really, really liked that game. Of course, when you're playing it as a little kid, I wasn't really playing games to progress through them. It was just fun picking up a controller and running around as a character and beating up on enemies. I didn't really know about, you know, what the goal was or how to progress that far. But, yeah, comparing it to Banjo-Kazooie, I had DK64 when I was in, like, kindergarten. I actually didn't get into the Banjo games until I was in, like, middle school. That was, like, 2006 or so. Like, the year the Nuts and Bolts teaser came out, that was when I got used copies of the first Banjo and eventually the second one from Hollywood Video. And, you know, I fell in love with those games. I'm a huge fan of both the Banjo games. I did not think Tooie was significantly worse the way some people do. For me, both Banjo games are like neck and neck. It's like Mario 3 and Mario World, or Galaxy 1 and Galaxy 2. I love both of them. So comparing DK64 to them, it's, you know, I don't hate DK64 as much as most people. I don't really hate it at all, but you definitely see that it's the clone that got all the recessive genes. And even though I'm a huge Banjo fan, to this day I still look at the Banjo games with a bit of envy. Like, they're kind of sibling series. You know, they were made side by side with each other, but it's hard not to look at the Banjo-Kazooie games and thinking, and then looking at DK64 and going like, oh man, like, why couldn't some of that guidance have poured over into DK64? You know, Banjo-Tooie has those really convenient warp pads, and, you know, the ones in DK64 aren't nearly as convenient. And, you know, Banjo and Kazooie's moves, you know, the Talon Try is so useful, not just for getting up steep slopes, but you walk faster, and Lanky's Orang Stand isn't nearly as convenient as that. And, yeah, it's just, like I said, I'm a fan of both series, but it's really, I'll always look at Banjo with a bit of jealousy in that way, because I feel like DK deserves something in the 3 space that's something he can look back on proudly. Like, I mean, DK64 was a huge hit, and of course, and, you know, it was a financial success, and there's a lot of people who haven't played their 64 since it came out that have fond memories of that game. But in terms of something that, like, pushes the genre forward, I kind of wish that Donkey Kong himself had something like that in the 3D space. So, yeah, not much else to say on DK64. I guess one last thing I'll say is that growing up, my family actually never unlocked Tiny Kong. It's TJ again. That's actually the first time I got beat by the time limit on one of these calls. But I'll just quickly wrap up what I was saying. I was ending my last call saying, growing up, my family actually never unlocked Tiny Kong. My dad was the one who would progress through these games, and so we would game things at, you know, whatever his pace was and based on his skill. So he had Chunky Kong, he made it to Frantic Factory, but Tiny Kong we just never had. And because of that, even though we saw her on all the marketing and in the intro and the manuals and stuff, I don't think we ever knew her name. Maybe her name is mentioned somewhere in the manual, but I just didn't know it. But yeah, we grew up calling her just the girl Kong. We knew Tiny. I mean, we knew Chunky, we knew Lanky, we knew Diddy, we knew Donkey Kong. We never knew Tiny's name until like years later. I picked up the game on my own again and eventually found her. And again, that was like in middle school when I had the game in like kindergarten. But yeah, so sorry for double calling, but again, thank you guys for taking the call.
Well, thank you for the calls, TJ. Bleak alternate timeline there where Tiny remains in her cage for years on end and nobody ever comes to rescue her.
Oh no. That reminds me of a cute story. Well, not knowing Tiny's name. My little brother, like I said, he was like 5 when we were playing the game, and for some reason he could never remember Chunky's name, or he couldn't pronounce it or something, so he always just called him the last member, because that's what the DK rap calls him. So whenever we'd see a boulder, he'd be like, oh, the last member can lift it. Go get the last member. He's the last member of the DK crew. That's him. At least he didn't call him one hell of a guy, or my parents would have definitely taken the game away.
Right. Well, I think the last member might be even more risque, depending on who you ask.
Yeah, but I didn't know that when I was a kid. No. I didn't understand that innuendo.
I mean, I think it's perfectly fine to not know Tiny Kong's name or Chunky Kong's name when Rare didn't know most of the cast name. But I'm also kind of envious that TJ, Martros, you, like, everybody had the green N64, and I had the standard black N64 that I had to get because the modern Donkey Kong was in Mario Kart 64. Like, maybe if my obsessive need to chronicle every aspect of his fictional life hadn't overwhelmed me, I would have just gotten an N64 when Donkey Kong 64 came out. But then again, look what I would have missed out on in real time. The thrill of hating on Banjo-Kazooie when it was announced, and then the joy of discovering that it was okay to enjoy it because Diddy Kong was his friend.
Yeah, and another thing about the Tiny thing is actually one of the first challenge runs I can remember as a kid that I just invented on my own was just to see how far in the game I could get without Tiny, because I realized that you didn't actually need to beat Mad Jack until you got to Hideout Helm, basically. So I would just like see how far I could get and how much I could collect without ever having Tiny to open things up or do anything. So you can get pretty far in the game like that. I mean, you can probably do a lot, but as a kid, I couldn't figure out how to do absolutely everything. So I would always give up, I don't know, pretty late in the game and have to go back and get her. But
Poor Tiny.
It's just kind of interesting.
Poor Tiny.
I mean, I don't know. They designed it so you don't actually need her for a really long time.
Nintendo's going to release the official Donkey Kong timeline at some point soon, and they're going to like put Returns and Tropical Freeze under the Tiny is never rescued timeline.
They find Tiny skeleton in her cage years later. It's messed up.
Yeah. That's just, it's like, why Nintendo? Why is this necessary? Why do we have to have dark branching timelines out of all your mega franchises? It's just not needed. You can just put it all in the same linear timeline and it works just fine. TJ brought up a good point that kind of segues us into our final thoughts. And you know, Donkey Kong 64 is divisive. There's no way around it. Yes, it has its fans. Yes, it has its appreciators. Even those of us who have fault to find with it still love a lot about it. But Donkey Kong 64 has been it as far as 3D Donkey Kong adventures. I mean, yeah, Donkey Kong was in the last two Skylanders games. Doesn't really count, let's be honest. Donkey Kong Adventure, the Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle DLC, more of a tactical RPG than it is, 3D platformer. So, again, doesn't really count under the same criteria. And having Donkey Kong Country come back in 2010, Donkey Kong Country Returns, felt like a great moment. I know not everyone loves that interpretation of Donkey Kong Country, but it was very successful, led to Tropical Freeze, which is more widely beloved, and has led to Donkey Kong Country having its own theme park opening in just under 2 weeks. So that being said, it always feels kind of weird to look back and say, this was Donkey Kong's only shot at a 3D platformer. We have not gotten one since then. And I know Vicarious Visions was working on their project that would have been a 3D platformer. We didn't get it. Fell through. We don't know what Nintendo has cooking up for Donkey Kong. It could be a 3D platformer. I think a lot of us are kind of hoping that's the next step in the franchise. But we don't know yet. Too soon to say. So Donkey Kong 64 has been it for 25 years now. And one of the questions that is often posited to me as the editor-in-chief of DK Vine is, do you think they will ever remake Donkey Kong 64? Or do you think they should remake Donkey Kong 64, but, fix things about it? Maybe not go as far as the randomizer, but make it so that you eliminate the tag barrels entirely, and you can just become the Kong you want on the fly. Which is also another augmentation that's been made to Donkey Kong 64 as well, in recent years, by the fans. But I want to hear your thoughts on this, Courtney, because I have my own opinions, but I want to hear what you, a stalwart DK64 defender, has to say.
I mean, I would much, much rather just see a new 3D adventure, and I think they could build off a lot of the elements in DK64, like having different Kongs, but obviously being able to swap much more efficiently. And it's kind of like someone else was saying earlier, one of the callers, I believe, that like, what if there were multiple ways to solve a problem, and you could maybe decide which Kong you wanted to use? And I think maybe with some of the stuff Nintendo has learned in recent things, like Zelda games, where there's so many different ways you could approach a problem, like, maybe each of these Kongs has different abilities, but you can, maybe like Chunky can lift boulders and create a path, but maybe you could also just fly over there with Tiny's ponytail twirl. Like, I don't know, like, obviously I'm not a game designer, but I feel like you could easily make a variety of obstacles that you'd have to clear, but there could be lots of different paths you could take using the different Kong's abilities to approach a given situation. And I think that's something that, like, so like the Zelda games have been doing this recently, where they want it to be really open-ended with how players approach things, but they still have been very much based on like one character who has a variety of powers. Like Link can do all of these different things, or Zelda can make all these different echoes in the newest Zelda game. But I don't think they've really approached it from a perspective of like, what if there were different characters that you could swap between who each did different things? And I think that's maybe the niche that like a DK game in this sort of new sandboxy genre could fill, because like the DK series has always been about, well, at least since Donkey Kong Country, has always been about different characters cooperating. And as far as if they would remake DK64, like, I mean, I could see them doing it with like quality of life improvements, but I mean, I just don't really feel like it's really Nintendo's modus operandi to remake a 3D platformer like that. Like, I mean, I know they did stuff like the Zelda Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask on the 3DS, but that was essentially the same game, more or less, with just like some quality of life from having two different screens and slightly updated graphics. But if they were to remake DK64, they'd need to remake it very heavily, and that's something that like the Spyro series has gotten and the Crash Bandicoot series has gotten, but I just don't really feel like it's something Nintendo would do. I could be wrong, but I would personally much just rather see a new game.
Yeah, I think that people see stuff like the Zelda remakes, or probably more aptly, as you said, that the Crash and Spyro remakes, and they're just like, we want that. And you get that with the Banjo fandom. They want Banjo-Kazooie remade, and I'm just like, is it really necessary? I don't know. Like, ukulele, I get. And that's kind of intriguing because it's like Platonic saying, we can make a better game. Watch. So I'm interested in that, but I think like a remake just for remake's sake, that's always where I kind of, I don't know. And I think fans overlook one of the critical points about Donkey Kong 64 being remade is Rare's no longer with Nintendo. And a lot of these remakes are either done with a cooperation or direct input from the studios that had a hand in them. So I know Rare and Nintendo have a much better working relationship than they've had in years, but I don't see how that would translate to a full game remake for a Nintendo system. It's one thing for their past library to be put on NSO. It's another thing entirely for a game to be remade. And I think if Nintendo were investing the capital in a 3D Donkey Kong game, they would just make a new one. So I think it's okay to leave some stuff in the past. I think it's okay to leave some things as relics of the year they came out in. We don't need to constantly be remaking stuff. Make this old stuff available for sure. Put it on NSO, always have it be available. But I think it's a fool's errand to try to remake Donkey Kong 64 and kind of elevate it to modern sensibilities, or even the sensibilities that it should have adhered to in 1999. I don't see the point of that. I think it's just kind of picking at a scab. It's not letting a wound heal. And I love Donkey Kong 64. I love a lot about it. I have my issues with it, but I would much rather see a new Donkey Kong game. This is what I'm always going to say. It's what I'm going to say about Banjo-Kazooie as well, right? Like, at the end of the day, life is short. I don't know, how many more Donkey Kong games are going to be in my future at this rate. It's been over 10 years since the last new standalone Donkey Kong game. So if I get a new release, I kind of want it to be a new release. I want it to be a new experience. I don't want to just revisit past glories or past mistakes even. I want to experience something new with these characters.
Yeah, I agree.
I just bum myself out talking about my own mortality and the possibility that I could only see like 3 or 4 more Donkey Kong games in my lifetime if current trends continue. That's bleak. Not the snowman either. That's just depressing to think. Like, I know I always say I'm going to come back as a ghost and haunt everyone to talk about Donkey Kong, but the truth is I don't know how to like access a spirit door or haunt a minecart or anything. I would just be myself with a sheet over me, and I wouldn't even really be dead at that point, so it doesn't really count. So yeah, is there anything else you would like to add about Donkey Kong 64 before we wrap things up?
Yes, I forgot to mention this earlier, but in DK64 Randomizer, you can replace one of the Kongs with Crusha. You can play as Crusha in the main adventure, and I think that's awesome. I love Crusha. Anyway, so there's that. I forgot to say that earlier. But also something that I would be extremely mad at myself if I didn't bring up, because I am one of his #1 fans. He is my favorite video game character of all time. I love K. Rool in this game. I just really love him. He's menacing in that way where they obviously tried to make him a little bit like Darth Vader-esque with his heavy breathing and stuff and his really deep voice. But he doesn't have a full like new persona in this game, but he becomes a boxer just for the end of it. And I really like that for him. I really love how showboaty he is. I think the final battle is incredible. I think the music is great, and it kind of reuses motifs that Grant has been using for K. Rool and cutscenes and stuff throughout the whole game. I love his little cutscenes that he gets where he's angry at his failure subordinates, even though sometimes it doesn't make sense. Like, I don't know how he's watching the Kongs in this some kind of barrel dimension that they're in. It just makes no logical sense, but I just wanted to throw out how much I love K. Rool in this game.
He's great. I really like the cutscenes. I think that the cutscenes provide something that Banjo-Tooie doesn't, where Banjo-Tooie more or less just forgets the threat of the BOB, of this doomsday device that Gruntilda and her sisters have access to. Like, as soon as they zombify King Jingling, we just don't get back to it. There's not that lingering threat of this apocalypse hanging over your head, whereas Donkey Kong 64 constantly reminds you that the island is in danger, that K. Rool is still sitting in his chair, plotting and scheming, and you better get to it, Kongs, or else it's all going to end in hellfire for you. So I really appreciate that. It does bug me in that boss fight at the end that K.
That
Rool,
he has an extra toe?
that his toes do not match.
Yeah, he's got 3 toes normally, but in the boss fight he has 4.
You go into his shoes and
is it 4 or 5?
Yeah, he's got the wrong amount of toes, the wrong shape of toes. His toes do not match any depiction of his toes, including in-game elsewhere when he's not dressed as the boxer. And the only explanation I can think of is that he's wearing a mechanical boxer suit with robotic toes. And you say, that's stupid, Hyle. That's dumb. Well, you know what else is dumb? Having the wrong amount of toes is dumb. I also like the character of the Beanstalk in Fungi Forest. We called him Sprout.
The bean is a big meme in the randomizer community because, like, there's only one bean in the whole game. And so sometimes you need it to complete the seed, but most of the times you don't. But everyone's always excited to see the bean. When you're watching a race and people see the bean, everyone cheers. We all love the bean. The bean is like the main character of the randomizer.
We all love the bean, whether you play the Donkey Kong 64 randomizer or you just play Donkey Kong 64 vanilla. We all love the bean because it gives us Sprout the Beanstalk, one of the most underrated characters in all video games, really. Thank you, Bean. Thank you.
Thank you for just being you. I'm sorry.
This has been a File 2 production.
Que rico.